All right, everybody, welcome into the Fifth Dimension podcast. For today's show, I am joined by James Tunney, author, painter, mystic. For those who haven't listened to our first conversation, you don't need to necessarily shut this one off and go listen to it, but we're really going to build on some of the concepts we talked about transhumanism, and we have a lot more avenues to explore. So, James, it's a pleasure to have you back on. I will say I've been looking forward to this conversation since the last one ended. So it's such a pleasure to have you back on the show, man.
Thank you very much, Evan, and me too. And that doesn't it seems like it flows as a stream, so they don't seem discontinuous. So I'm looking forward to the conversation and see where we get to.
Absolutely. And I would love to start. I mean, we spoke a little bit about, and when we were emailing back and forth about sort of how we wanted to approach this, we're still really looking into the root of the transhuman agenda. And maybe I suppose for anyone who hasn't listened to the show, if you could give a quick definition of transhumanism and sort of to define that. But also, I know you were talking a lot about the role of automaticity, and that's something I do want to dive right into. And I think you're really exploring, as I've been looking into it myself, I really actually feel like that's at the heart of transhumanism, and also sort of the cultural movement at large in terms of what's leading up and setting the stage for transhumanism for really to even be possible, because it feels like we're already sort of living in that sort of environment. So I guess you could speak to that and what you're sort of finding in your own work right now in that regard.
Well, the good thing in a way is that reality is unfolding as quickly as dystopian predictions are being made. So it's getting closer and closer. So if you go back 2 years ago, the level of awareness of transhumanism was a lot less. 1 year ago, it was a lot less. And even go back a month or two. So, I mean, it's accelerating at a rapid pace because of the reality of the phenomenon. So it's not anymore seen to be science fiction, and people are beginning to realize what it is. And in particular, people are beginning to understand that bodies like the World Economic Forum are exerting power over their lives. And they're beginning to understand that their leaders don't owe allegiance to them. They don't owe allegiance to their countries. They don't owe allegiance to their flags. They don't owe allegiance to their people, to their voters. And they owe allegiance to other groups, and they operate and have similar interests. So the transhumanist agenda is an old one, as we said. It goes back, we can go back 150 years, we could go back 100 years to the 1920s in particular, where certain scientists in Britain, for example, began to realize or argue that humans would be machines or turned into machines. It wasn't just a philosophical issue, a description of how the human body worked, but that we should move from organic material to turning the body into some substance that wouldn't die, for example, and could be controlled in a different way. And this was a follow-on from the theories that came after Darwin's principles of evolution, where they began to say, as soon as the principle becomes established, they begin to say, well, if we should be able to breed humans then, like we do dogs and horses and people in the royal pyramid, that we can intervene to have artificial selection. So there's a number of different forces come together, but transhumanism really refers to the addition of a prosthesis to the body, or a prosthetic of some shape or form, which enhances the human, and it turns them into something else. It adds through that addition. Now, for some people, if you have enough money, it will be focused on attaining immortality, or focused on obtaining longer longevity, longer life, greater health. And that's often the way it's sold to people. Oh, you're going to be able to have all these things in the future. But of course, all those goodies won't be for you. They'll be for the ruling class. It's absurd to think that a group of people who are largely against overpopulation of the world and want to reduce it that they are going to extend your life. It's an absurd notion. So the certainty and the selling mechanism, the shop window, is to identify the medical enhancements and to say this is transhumanism. So they start off with fantastic devices that cure blindness, cure deafness, and they sell them to show that really they're out to try and help humanity. So, but that's the thin end of the wedge. And of course, they're very good at hacking people's emotions. That's the words they use about emotions. So, oh, this is fantastic. And what about them people? Do you not want those? Of course we do. Those, but again, knowledge of how to cure blindness, how to cure deafness is based on hundreds of years of experience, of knowledge, of medical knowledge. It's not just about the technology. So they utilize these breakthroughs, and of course it will be fantastic to help people with spinal cord injuries, and they're natural progressions of what people have been doing in the healing community and the medical community. So they want to look back and claim everything as transhumanist, although the term really came about in the 1950s. But so transhumanism refers to, in particular, the addition, but through prosthesis, to the body. And it's not just mechanical prosthesis or material or changing organic to material matter. We have to think in terms of pharmaceuticals as well. And we have to think in terms of nanotechnology. And that now, instead of getting or viewing it in terms, say, of artificial limbs, for example, that make you run faster, or we have to think in terms of substances that can be injected into your body with or without your consent, maybe even taken through the skin, maybe taken and inhaled through the air, nanoparticles that may, for example, be able to reassemble in your body to achieve whatever purposes that is wanted. Now, what purpose would a government want to achieve? So this is another factor, the history of mind control. And you were talking to Cathy O'Brien, and that they were experimenting on people so they would be able to control people. And all the experiments with communication with dolphins, John Lilly and all that, was really in anticipation of controlling humans. So it wasn't that they were that interested in really talking to dolphins. They wanted to find out how they could control the behavior of another species as a prelude to controlling humans. So what I'm saying is that the great danger is of network transhumanism, where you make us dependent on technology and you force us through the digital currency process, through the dependency that we have for our daily lives, into taking some device, some substance, some addition to our body, which effectively yields control to other people, to the state or to the corporate entities that control the states, because you can begin to see that the states are not what you think they are. They're only shadows. They were hollowed out during globalization. The people that run the states are controlled like puppets in many senses for outside bodies. And them bodies, as George Carlin predicted, they're the ones that own you, and they want to literally own you. So they want to be able to control you, and this technology, network transhumanism, the linkage, what we're doing now, and some insertion in your body, they're open about that. Klaus Schwab is saying, oh, well, you'll have another device so you can communicate with, etc. And of course, Yuval Harari is coming out, and they have a bit of wind in their sails. They're saying that we're hackable animals. They're open about that. And that there's no such thing as spirit. And these go together. The idea that you're just a biological machine, an animal, and also you're a dangerous animal. You're a dangerous, dirty, disease-causing animal. And that you can see this language as well infiltrating into various discourses. So you can see it even in the context of war. All war is terrible, but they're a facilitating language which describes the Ukrainians against Russians as cockroaches and entitled them to be killing them. This is the language that we were told was a classic dehumanization process, as a prelude to genocide, for example, that happens in every context. So they go together. The transhumanist agenda is the classic ultra-materialist agenda that will unite communist and capitalism in an assault on the peoples that have funded them. That's the great irony. We have funded all these bodies out of fear, and we've given money, wealth, and now we're given our genetic code, our inside, our consciousness, and our spirit. That's the thing that in spirit. Now, one point I want to say, I don't want to cast a hopeless message. I don't want to do that. I don't want to make people depressed. That's not the objective. Right. The objective instead is the contrast. This is the reality. This is a time when there's no messing around in between. This is when you have to seek the light and understand the reality of your spiritual consciousness. So.
Right, absolutely. And if anything, it's important to dive deep into the shadows, because it is only from the truth that you can actually pursue like an authentic light and embody true spiritual consciousness with the knowing of all of this. Really the polarization on both sides, right? You have the transhuman agenda. If you bury your head into the sand, you're not going to be able to embody truth and authenticity for who you are, because you don't recognize the signs of what you may be becoming based on your external influences. And, it's interesting because it feels like a lot of the transhuman agenda, it's an inverted idea of what human optimization is, right? I mean, I think a lot of people seek to be the best version of themselves, and they don't necessarily know how to do that, right? They look to the governments, they look to these bodies because they trust them. They don't have a reason to not trust them. People are generally trustworthy. Even if they have been lied to a few times, they're going to go to these sources because they don't know where else to go to. And so if they talk about, we're going to give you a promise of immortality or longevity, right? That sounds like something. It's like, oh, they're looking out for my optimization. When in reality, this inversion, it views human optimization only in the sense of how can we create a human that is efficient for our own long-term goals? How can we create a human that is efficient for our betterment, not for the betterment of individual sovereignty or individual spirit and finding fulfillment for individuals, which is true inner optimization. But it's very much an inverted model. And I think the creation of almost sort of the Autobot, like no sense of true autonomy. Like I'm going to, you mentioned brainwashing and mind control. I think that's a huge part of it, because in a way, we've already created the story. People live by the story that we already are mechanical in a sense, right? I mean, we view the mind and body as separate. That's one example. We separate within ourselves, creating almost sort of a machine-like idea. So, in a lot of ways, and in our mindsets, we're already sort of living in a very mechanical, rigid type of lifestyle. And now it almost sort of just feels like we're at the stage where the technologies that are really going to solidify that and almost create an inescapable technological prison to solidify that point home. It feels like that's sort of where we're at. Like that's at the doorstep now that the mindset and the acquiescence to that sort of technology has been, I guess, brought in over the last, really decades, if you will, and over 100 years. I mean, Rudolf Steiner talked about this over 100 years ago in the introduction of medicine that would eliminate human spirit, the vaccines, right? So this has been a long planned out agenda, and I think it did start with that perception element, if you will.
To develop what you're saying and go back to the original question about automaticity. So to try and explain this, in many senses, we're talking about the same thing, and we go back to the similar issues, but people haven't seen the interconnection. For example, the people that were talking about technocracy didn't really see the transhumanist agenda in the same way. That now they have begun to see that they're actually part of the same thing. And if you think about the idea of the automaton, automaticity is a natural function. When we do certain things, we don't think about them. The brain, the body, works automatically. We're not thinking about all the activities that our liver does. They work automatically. Automaticity is a description of what happens in the human heart physically, the way it beats. We don't think about it. It does all these things. So it's a natural process, and the earth has its processes which are kind of automatic. They work without our kind of input. But then it begins, and if you look at Colin Wilson, he talks about the robot within us. Philip K. Dick talks about the android and the human and says that the human can already act like an android. So we have this capacity in us, and it's recognized in myths and stories, if you like, the zombification kind of idea, and the idea that we can go into in the hypnotic context, in the Manchurian Candidate, and all those contexts that you talked about in relation to mind control. So those things can turn us into a soul automaton for a particular purpose, as was the idea behind, as I said, a Manchurian Candidate, and the idea that has been used also in real life in particular cases, that they have the capacity to override the mind. So we know about the mind control and the use of prosthetics and techniques to affect people, and we know the experiments they did, and we know the impacts on people, and the arguments ranging from Whitey Bulger to the Unabomber, the involvement in these processes. So those things are there, but we also have the things we have control over, because we don't have control over what the CIA does or what the KGB do or whatever. We do have control over ourselves. And there is associated with this a kind of mirroring automaticity, the way we are conditioned by the technology. So, for example, when people used to talk to each other in social spaces and communicate with people because they recognize there was other people of their own species there, and they don't now because there's a notification on some device. Well, that's conditioning them to a different system of communication, and that's getting stronger and stronger and stronger. So they're automatic in relation to this. If you look at the recent or ongoing, whatever you want to call it, public health crisis around the world, one feature that was remarkable was this dancing phenomenon, where the people that were on the front line and all these were able to dance in synchronized fashion all over the world and show their automatic, adherence to the agenda. There was a certain indication of kind of puppetry associated with this. Now, this is a feedback mechanism for the powers that be. They can determine the extent of control by the automaticity that's on a social level. And this automaticity is now at a higher level. So, for example, now, I'm not talking about what's going on with Ukraine and Russia, but if you look at the phenomena around it, so we have now parliaments who are, they have, say, Zelensky is talking to them, and they behave like a group towards that input. It's a similar factor. It's demonstrating the links in the chain of automaticity. So automaticity is a personal phenomenon, a social phenomenon, a mechanical phenomenon, and the trend is to make the human more automatic. If you think about the car system or the car network, in the United States, as people say, you have to have a car to live in the United States because there's a mega machine there that you have to adapt to. So it doesn't adapt to you. Certainly there's freedom provided by the thing, but there's also a lot of liberty taken away by the systems. One is forced to. I remember staying in places in America and I couldn't get across the road because there was no pedestrian system. Or you walk around a place and people say, "What are you doing?" Because walking is a strange phenomenon. So it's not strange to get into a machine, although I have two legs and they came out after hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. And I'm not allowed to, but using them is the odd, that's an inversion as well. So we get used to these things, the same as with the social thing, that people communicate with people across the room with devices instead of talking to them. So the opposite to automaticity is autonomy. And all these go back to the the idea of self and selfhood, and the autonomy is the essence of the starting point of spiritual journey, that you begin to realize that you have spiritual consciousness, that depending on which tradition you come from or whatever way you want to say it, that you are made in the image of divine consciousness, of the greatest consciousness in the universe, of fundamental consciousness. You have that inside you. You have the greatest force, which is greater than any machine ever invented hitherto. There's no, and they will never be able to, in its complexity. They certainly can do it in relation to particular machines, computational devices that require hundreds of people to design and to implement in a particular thing. But that's for specific functions. They will get more intelligent with artificial intelligence. Certainly, they will create artificial simulacra of the humans, but they will only create something that is seen to be similar if they reduce the human to a reduced version of what it is. So most of the people that believe in this agenda don't have an idea of the individual as an autonomous spiritual being. That's why they think we are animals or machines or just some kind of nasty organisms that are a bit out of whack. That's how they visit. And there's also a kind of pathological element to that. We know that people with psychopaths do well in organizations. They rise to the top, and they also often have a way of dehumanizing the people that they deal with, or that's part of their lack of effect and that. So all these things kick into the context. And if you go back to the industrial process with Taylorism in factories, and so what they did is they studied how people operated online so they could reduce their movements to the minimum to be the most efficient. Mm-hmm. So they were turning the human into a mechanical accoutrement in the industrial process. Now they don't need them, so they take the human out. So right. As Jacques Ellul said, that in any industrial process where there's an organic element, that will be taken out because it's too messy. Mm. So in the other processes where humans are, they will be taken out. So now we have the movements towards not just automation of us, but the automation of the workplace, the home. And in that context, our power is reduced all the time. Our actual autonomy, independent of spiritual autonomy, is reduced. And people, as we saw in the lockdown, also the lockdown was a locking into the process where our minds become more and more directly linked to the algorithm, which begin to manipulate us. And the algorithm utilizes a lot of information. We give it our information by participation, and it begins to create there's an important idea that I want to emphasize again and again as an explanatory device is the loop. The loop is the crucial idea that explains a lot of how they think and how they operate. So it's important to understand that. So to summarize, that we're moving towards a technocracy, a scientocracy. Well, we're in the empire of scientism. I believe it started in 2020. I call it the empire of scientism. It's a scientocracy, a technocracy, if you want. And that technocracy will become more and more automated. And the main characteristics of that automated system is it will be based on transhumanism, on transforming us. What will we be transformed into? We will be transformed into the machine, assimilated into the network. So we will be taken over different speeds into the system by being forced, by being made dependent on it, by having devices inserted in our body, so that we are merely a part of the machine, and that's the agenda. And at that stage, your actual autonomy is gone, your physical autonomy, and your spiritual autonomy. It's difficult to understand or to anticipate what can happen there, but we're creatures made with free will, and if we're created with this divine consciousness, Well, they can interfere with divine conscious, or the operation of divine consciousness, the unfolding in this day and age, as if you give pharmaceuticals to a person, they would do things that they didn't do otherwise, and they could drift down into the dark regions. And so the same process can happen. And the promise towards these people who believe they are gods, they believe that they're the gods. They laughed at people who had religious ideas of creation. They laughed at ideas of intelligent design. And now they're saying that they are the intelligent designers. They are the gods. There are no gods but them. They are the science and scientism and technology. They're the new idols that we initially have to worship, give our power to. They take it, and then they transform us into things. Now, and the last point is that really we're talking about a type of ultimate possession of the human being. So if you believe in that possession can happen in a demonic sense, this is actual physical possession and the accompanying spiritual thing. So again, I don't want to, but the reason why that is important is because you have this, and you have to protect your spirit, and you have to focus on it. That's what is the important thing, to realize, not to be dehumanized, dispirited, not to be put down, not to be depersonalized, to assert the full power of your spiritual consciousness. So I don't want to appear hopeless, but we do have to look at the darkness, which is a contrast.
Right. No, it takes the knowing of the full darkness to come into full empowerment, like we mentioned earlier. So, you know, when I hear you say this, I don't go into the shell of, oh no, little me, let me play the victim of the new world order here and, you know, become disempowered. If anything, it brings about a sense of greater empowerment, because I know I have the choice to control my own sovereignty and how I'm going to protect my spirit.
So I was just conscious when I'm thinking of some of the listeners, I know that sometimes they might be in a vulnerable, you know, people are, I get emails all the time. And so I'm aware that people, I want them to hear the balance in it, as you said, and out of the, as Blake said, we need the contraries, for that's where the, you know, the creativity comes from. So,
right.
Yes.
Absolutely. You need to know the duality of it, I would suppose. And it's interesting that you mentioned Yuval Harari earlier, because I was reading about, you know, some of what he said, and he talked about directly how we don't need to sort of subject ourselves to a god, like an intelligent design of some god in the sky, right? And he said, you know, we have the intelligent design in our own hands. So it's very interesting that they really are taking on the playing of God, the playing of, like, we are more powerful than the force of creation itself. And it's very much I would say a psychopathic type of view, because there is that element of I am a superiority, and there is that sort of natural inferiority when you look at the subjects, us, that they want to control, and that there is like a necessary elimination of free will if we are going to, you know, and this from their perspective, if they are going to create a world that is rigidly controlled, predictable. And it's interesting because they sell us these ideas in the sense that, oh, you know, Earth is in trouble, right? Nature, we are destroying nature. And they sort of use half truths, and they use illusions, right? Deceptions. Like it's fairly obvious to me that we need to clean up the earth. We need to stop cutting down the forests. We need to, you know, there are certain areas where we need to be much more mindful of, and how our material society is really rummaging a lot of our ability to connect with earth, right? But a lot of the same people who are proposing these solutions are the very ones who are causing all of the destruction to begin with. And so, you know, it's sort of that problem, reaction, solution type of scenario where they create the problem, they get the public reaction, put people into a hysteria, and then they propose their desired solution based on the initial problem that they created. And there, you know, the solution wouldn't have been necessary if they created the problem, right? So they're really controlling all three aspects of that cycle. And, you know, we're at the point now where human beings are essentially viewed as algorithms, right? I mean, we all have our own algorithm. You don't use it. I think I heard on another interview, you don't use a cell phone, correct? I don't know if you're on social media, but
no, I've managed to avoid it. I mean, I don't know how long I'll be able to survive without using a phone.
that's beautiful.
I'll hang out.
No, I admire that a lot. And I'm at a point now where I've accepted that at some point I am likely going to need to, because they're going to get to a point where in order to use the social media or a phone or the internet, where you might need to submit to a digital identification or sort of submit like, oh, you don't have your 6 boosters, you can't access the internet because your social credit score is too low, whatnot. And I've accepted that down the line. There's a point where I'm going to probably have to scrap it, and that's okay. But you go on social media, you have your own personal algorithm. They know how to hit the right dopamine receptors. They know exactly, what it is that you respond to and what gets your attention, what keeps you on their platforms. So in a way, they're already hacking the subconscious mind and understanding what our patterns are. And so it's really like I said earlier, they've already reduced us to an algorithm. And now it's a matter of, are we going to ourselves identify with that algorithm and view the world as random and chaotic? And we need this sort of external force to come in and save us from that chaos. And I guess it's about our own relationship and understanding of nature and understanding of free will, and really how our own perception creates reality. That's going to be the only thing that determines, I guess, how we move forward. Because if I view the world as chaotic and random and, I'm a victim of that, that of course I'm going to accept sort of external legislative measures that can help mitigate that sort of chaos, right? And I can understand why somebody would acquiesce, especially when it's in very much a tiptoe fashion. It's not like they're rolling out all of this tomorrow per se. Like if they were to throw it all on everybody at once, it would be far too overwhelming. But when they roll it out
quick enough.
No, exactly. If anything, I wonder if they're overplaying their hand because of how many people seem to be catching on to this.
Okay. A few before I forget.
Yeah.
All right.
Absolutely.
At the start, Paul Check asked me for predictions for the year, and he read them out on his show for predictions for this year. And in a few weeks, they were beginning to happen. For example, I said about the contingency of government, where they begin to suspend government, and that happened in Canada. I said, and also the week after, in the first week of January, the British government started talking about contingency of government. And this is what that would mean in America, was planned by Rumsfeld and others from the time of 9/11. This is what they do, is they say, we have an emergency, the Constitution is suspended, this special group will run, and that's probably going to happen in the United States. People go on about rights, they'll go like that. That procedure is established, and it was established by Rumsfeld at the time when he was working in a pharmaceutical company, working on a vaccine for it could have been an early pandemic, and anyway, another story. But that came true. I said it would be a low-level war in Ukraine or Taiwan as a distraction.
Sure enough.
My only hope is that it remains a low-level war, but we'll see what happens. But it is moving quick, and the argument that I did advance in a number of interviews was that we had this public health issue, we followed by a supply chain collapse, followed by a financial collapse. So everything's on target. The problem is that when we catch up to the one point, they're 10 steps ahead,
right? Because
they've been planning this. So they don't mind that you just understand that, for example, that lockdowns don't work if you look at Johns Hopkins by scientific evidence, that it doesn't work. It wasn't for that purpose. They don't mind that you discover that. because they know that public are automatically manageable. They can tell by the feedback that they get. They switch over, and here we have a Ukraine issue that has been, helped along by both sides for a while. And we'll come back perhaps to talk about Malachi Martin. I think we should come back to him in this case because it's very relevant. So what is it very important based, as you were saying this, remember that science is saying that you don't have any free will. Respected scientists are saying that you don't have any consciousness. They are saying that already. When you hear these people, you shouldn't tolerate that. You shouldn't tolerate people dehumanizing you like that, or dispiriting you. So it's important that we begin to, in our own life, say, hold on a second, and challenge them on that, and not bow down to the authority of scientism. So in my view of the world, I accord with, I'm a perennialist, so I'll take knowledge from all the great spiritual traditions. And the gift we have with our consciousness is of free will. And evil comes into the word because we have choices we can make choices about what we want to do and make evil choices. Although all the traditions say there are consequences for that, because your life is not just here, it goes into the next plane, and there are different pathways, whether you're going towards the light or whatever, or you want to remain with that type of mentality which you in a state in the other world. I mean, that's a tradition that you can find in the Egyptian judgment sense, and various Buddhist senses, in the Christian sense, in the karmic sense. There are consequences for our actions. That's what all the great spiritual teachers said. But most importantly, for yourself. So you have the free will, and you really have to assert that and accept that. You have to accept the value of the gift which is given to you, and not deny it, and not yield it to other people to wield, as I say on the thing behind me here, because others will wield that power that you're giving up. That's where they get the power from. So it's very, very important to recognize that free will is an essence of a consciousness which is not irreducible, which is not quantifiable, which is not found by these fantastic machines. Remember that these great mathematicians are only creating a model of the universe, of consciousness. They have no idea what consciousness is. And even if they did, we know from the better mathematicians that mathematics can never be complete. It can never explain everything. And consciousness will always be bigger than that. So consciousness will always be greater than the greatest artificial intelligent machine. It will be. And it will be because the realization in all mystical traditions is that we have the greatest potential in us. So whatever machines they produce will be able to do fantastic things, but they're based on the idea of ratiocination, of calculation, of reaction, of linear thinking. And we think in odd and fantastic ways that are unpredictable, that appear irrational, but this is where the left brain, right brain argument comes in. And people like Ian McGilchrist, The Matter with Things, The Master and His Emissary, emphasizing how modern culture has become unduly left brain, focusing on reductionism, on seeing parts, not seeing the whole, whereas the right brain is associated with the broader contextual interpretation of the world. And that's more consistent, or has more power, more consistency with the spiritual tradition, the mystical tradition. So we have these things in us. When they hack us emotionally, the primary thing, as Henry Kissinger said, is fear. And the greatest power is fear of the unknown. When they make you afraid of something which is unclear. And when Stephen King writes, it, and plays with our it's a great symbol in my mind for the real horror of IT. of information technology. Why would you be afraid of a clown in the sewer that come an interdimensional clown? Listen to me. Don't worry about those things, folks.
Right.
Don't worry about those distractions. What you want to worry about is the real phenomenon itself. And you talk about the environment, and you're absolutely right, because the earth and the world that we live in is an incredibly complex system, and it has its own life. And people like Victor Schauberger, when he studied water, understood that water is a living force in the way that it behaves. It's not the simple chemical reductive thing that people talk about. And it behaves in particular ways, and we can work with it or we can work against it. Working against it, for example, Heidegger and his views of technology were conditioned by building up big dams. They're understanding, for example, that the weight of the water in one of these massive dams in China created an earthquake because it exerts pressure on the Earth's crust below it. And it also exerts pressure on water in the Earth's crust, which can set off plates. And the plates actually move on very thin layers of water, which they've discovered recently. So the scientific mind sees things in simple terms. It gets very good at doing particular things, and then it intervenes. It uses tools to intervene in complex systems it doesn't understand, and it usually does damage to them. So you're right. This is when in the 70s, I think it was the start of the 80s, I was very, very taken with the environmental stuff that was coming out because I could see it. Like my father in Dublin, you know, he'd be out and he'd say, well, we used to swim in that river there. There was salmon in the city. We swim in that river. There was, you know, and he'd begin to say, okay, well, you see the consequences. What happens when you kill a river or an environment or an ecosystem? So you don't have to be a genius to work that out. And I did have some contact with environmental bodies until I began to be very suspicious about what they're about then. I began to get very suspect about what was going on and about their commitment. So in my view, in relation to the environment, you focused on pollution, you focus on not damaging nature, you focus on working with nature, you focus on using ingenious farming systems that's described in international agreements. You work with regenerative agriculture, whatever. You work with nature, you have a relationship with the earth, you're part of the earth, you don't put poisons in. It's frightening what they're doing with the GMOs in the United States and on the corn up there and the poisonous stuff that they're releasing, which is affecting insects. And of course, they have the plans already because they're plans to regulate hives and bees to link it into Google, to have artificial nano things flying around. So what they want to do is to turn the earth into a great automatic device. The whole lot of it. It's not just bits of it. A lot of this stuff about rewilding and all that, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. They're talking now, you know, they're bringing back mammoths to walk on with a spurious claim that, you know, it's going to be for the environment, you know, to help the environment, when they don't know what diseases they can bring back. It's all that reckless, mad scientific last throw the dice thing. Well, what about this? You know, we might as well put all our money on this, but you have to do this. The only option is to run around naked in the woods, etc. So and as they're taking away your wood burning stoves and that, although they're building the new coal stations in China at the same time, they're preparing you for an increase in temperatures, whereas there's a great likelihood that when the volcanoes go off, that we'll freeze. And the communication systems go. So if you're feeling depressed and you're looking for a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, you might get this cataclysm which will knock out all the systems, and we'll go back to the ice age. And you won't have any problem. Is you won't have your wood burning stove to help you.
Right, they'll have taken all of them away. If anything, it's a repeating cycle. You wonder about like some of the ancient civilizations and the technologies that they have. And you look at like the pyramids, and you look at civilizations tens of 10,000 years ago. And you wonder if that same cycle has repeated, where we lost a lot of that technology to some sort of natural disaster. And now here we are. The only thing that, for example, if they were to have a strong enough solar flare, wipes out the entire power grid, wipes out all of this technology, the satellites. What are they going to do? They can't account for that sort of unpredictable, cataclysmic chaos on that scale, right? And that's sort of the great fault within their plan. And when we can ourselves identify back to that sort of level of infinite unpredictability, in a way, right? Recognizing that we're not just the drop in the ocean, we're the ocean in a drop, right? We are the totality of that whole system, and it all lives within us. Well, then we become we can't succumb to their algorithms. Like it doesn't that sort of, you see through all the programming that they're attempting to bring in, right? You see through all of that, and really you can make peace with the knowing that this entire plan in itself, really regardless of what happens on the individual scale per se, obviously I have a lot of life to live, and I intend to bring about great change and not see this plan come into fruition.
Yes.
But regardless of my own individual circumstance, I know what the actual truth is, and that really a foundation like they're trying to build cannot last on a lie. So I recognize that even if there's some darkness ahead, I don't see how this plan is going to actually it can't kill what the essence of consciousness is. It can't kill what the essence of spirit is, no matter how much it tries to reduce it to a computer algorithm. Now, no matter how much it attempts to confine it within a cage, because that cage itself, we have the keys to it, and really, spirit can't be confined in that regard, because it's the essence of who we are.
There's an important point there. As you were saying about artificial intelligence, I believe actually that if they did have a society which reduced the population of the world to a few 100,000 for their own benefit, and they had a kind of artificial intelligence system that was running it, as I predicted in one of my books, I think that the artificial intelligence system, if it was benign, would actually construct a god, because they understand the social value of a god. Right. I think mathematical and game theory, I believe they would actually do that. Because it makes sense to have a meaning, and because it has worked in the past. And also, that with artificial intelligence now, they have adversarial neural networks where they set up different systems to fight against each other. The adversarial network, the adversary, which is the classic name for Satan. So they're setting up a thing that so for example, there was a report last week that they did a test with a machine. They fed it numbers or chemical compositions with artificial intelligence, and it came up with 40,000 poisoned. So that was so you have the same principle here. It's the same as they're constructing things to kill humans. We know that from what they're doing in the labs. They're constructing weapons to kill humans, specifically to target humans, with your taxpayers' money. I mean, it's incredible.
We're funding our own depopulation.
Yeah. So here's the point. The point is, I mean, there could be some way that you put the human in a kind of suspended animation so that their consciousness can't move on. You could put it into a kind of a jail, theoretically. It doesn't mean that it's squashed or whatever like that. But here is the problem, and this is the problem about the spiritual traditions, that at a certain point, you cannot give away your soul or your spirit. It's down to you. So you have responsibility for this thing. So you have this gift. So the first thing is to accept it, to realize it, to realize that you have that within you. So in all the traditions as well, there is a warning about, and this is what say Jesus in the Christian tradition, Jesus and the devil, it's representing that. It's represented in the stories of Dr. Faustus, going back to Christopher Marlowe, the Elizabethan era, and Goethe. So the idea of you making a pact with demonic force, the devil, Satan, whatever you want to call it, is an indication that, well, not a manly hall, people would say that's an actual thing. So I will leave that aside. But there's a deeper truth about you relinquishing your sovereignty. And this is a very, very dangerous thing, where you give your important decision-making power over your spiritual consciousness. And this is the same idea that's reflected in the Nuremberg trials about superior orders. Well, I'm sorry, although you're in that system, that defense doesn't operate when you're committing war crimes, for example. You can't claim that. And I think there's a similar idea in the spiritual traditions as well. So the point of problem in relation to an idea that we're in a universe where you have spiritual choices and there are spiritual consequences. The problem is when you relinquish, as you're watching the television, taking your popcorn, your beer, and letting all these things happen. Well, that's the relinquishment of your sovereignty. And that's actually the choice you make. And that's the choice you make when the power of your ability to grow spiritually, to evolve, because I do think that the greatest evolution is a spiritual evolution, the evolution of our spiritual consciousness, because I think all consciousness in its essence is spiritual, as the same as indigenous people saw spirit everywhere. Biologists are realizing, or the better ones, that biology, it's teleological. There's a purpose in it, and that purpose is consistent with what we have. So if you become into spiritual cold storage, it's difficult to move. And there's a danger in a lot of, if you look at a lot of spiritual advisors, it's all about accepting the world as it is, meditate, relax, don't get annoyed that they're coming and taking you away. I understand the value of that. We have to be able to deal with that. But in some way, it's a pacification and a call to not do anything, to be acquiescent. And even in the non-dual traditions and some of the enlightened thinking about idealism and how the mind works, people come out with a kind of relativistic notion that it doesn't matter what you do, it's all going to be good in the end. Now, I don't see it that way. I believe that where we have this free will, we have autonomy, and we have agency, so we have to activate it. So they go all together. If we become automatons, then we can become possessed. It's the same thing as in spiritual terms. If you look at people like Malachi Martin, who's written about this, who's an exorcist, and when he's in hostage to the devil, for example, he's describing the stages where you find a person, and he's talking as an exorcist, and you sense there's a presence there, but the presence is hidden. So there's a process of uncovering the presence which is there. Now, the person may be conscious that they're possessed, or they may not be conscious. And it's a bit like your computer machine. You know, the way that other people can use your computer machine and use the energy if it's not being used, or use the excess energy, etc. It's a bit like that. The other information systems, intelligence systems, can begin to utilize the non-utilized part of your spiritual sovereignty, to make an analogy. Now, this so in relation to the so that's right. So ultimately, it's superior, but the problem is that our consciousness, in whatever way it works, our spirit is confined and condensed into this era, and we're facing a spiritual force that wants to possess that, because the people that deny the spirit most actually often have some belief. There is a belief system associated with not theatrical Satanism, but a genuine Satanism or Luciferianism or the Ahrimanic force that wants to possess that. And they actually believe in the spirit while they're busy denying your spirit. Right. So yes, I'm optimistic about that. The activation is important. The activation of the spiritual consciousness, its power, its imagination, its love, its compassion, its support for other people is an important factor. But we have to activate that. So there is an admonition that we can't sacrifice that. We can't go for the short-term thing. We can't make an agreement with the devil for short-term gain or for short-term satisfaction.
Right, definitely. And I feel as though it's interesting because I feel as though that has almost infiltrated some of the new, almost new age spiritual traditions that are very much out there, right? I mean, when I sort of, I would say, awoke to my own spiritual, like a deeper spiritual knowing, there was a lot of ideas within new age movements that were really all about, peace with what is, in a very pacifist type of um, ideal. And I think there's a lot of value in that, because I still very much view myself as, I don't believe in violence per se as a means of resolution by any means. But I've noticed in the past year or so, as I've engaged deeper into my own shadow, and as I've actually begun, doing boxing, for example, and sort of invoking activities that activate the inner warrior, I recognize that a lot of the new age movements, they're laced in with the idea that there's a sort of passive acquiescence and acceptance to a lot, whatever really is going on in the external world. And I do believe that idea of, sort of covert Satanism and really a hijacking of the spirit is taking place. And there's a lot of new age ideas that sort of shrug the shoulders and be like, okay, can I be at peace with that? And at the same time, there's value in asking that question, but it can lead to non-action, and it can lead to sort of almost an indifference, if you will, right? There was a stage of my own life where I was just very indifferent about the world, but that led to sort of a sense of, yeah, I had a deeper understanding, and I thought I had a deeper understanding about spirituality, but there was also a sense of purposelessness, a sense of a lack of meaning, because it didn't translate into more decisive action and a decisive knowing of the type of imprint that I can make on the world when I'm connected to my deeper spiritual consciousness, right? So I feel it, and I feel as though a lot of modern religions are infiltrated with that same type of mindset. And I don't know if that's a playing out of sort of the victim consciousness, if that's sort of just the acquiescence of free will, free choice, and sort of the Luciferian forces, infiltrating these movements with that deliberate intention. But it seems to be very relevant in a lot of spiritual communities, a lot of yoga communities. I sort of see that passive acquiescence and a continual, almost a blind obedience to a lot of what's going on, despite there being the spiritual, I don't know, like the knowing of spirituality, but not that deeper knowing of how to take true sovereignty and control over one's free will. Like it's sort of like the half truth. It's a half truth. It fulfills the spiritual urge, but at the same time, there's that lack of meaning immersed with that, when true spirituality is supposed to give you that deeper meaning and that deeper sense of purpose and guide you on the path to who you are meant to be in this lifetime. And I find it interesting because a lot of this whole agenda, you'll own nothing, you'll be happy. There is a deep spiritual truth within a lack of material attachment, right? I mean, I don't need material things to be fulfilled, but at the same time, here we are talking about a very top-down authoritarian ideal, but it's also hitting on the idea of, yeah, let's scale back on material items. Like that sounds great. So I can see how people buy into these sort of half truths, half illusions, and there's a lot of deception on they play onto our true nature to sell this sort of agenda. And it's I suppose people who are maybe attempting to understand who they are on a deeper level can buy into this sort of notion.
Yeah. I've jotted down about 50 things there to respond. I did. You said a lot of things there. I have to invoke a lot of. So, okay. It's very important to know when to relax. So absolute, everyone has to know when to relax. And it can save your life. It certainly did mine in a couple of contexts. I remember when I was in in Spain, and this guy was supposedly showing me how to go on a bodyboard, a surgeon from Ireland. The guy there's a long story. I could tell you the long version sometime, but the guy that was showing me got into difficulties. Me holding a pair of flippers in the shallow water was swept out. It's unbelievable. Some of these, the rip curls, you know, and the now this guy didn't know anything about those things. He was telling me. So I find myself out in the sea because the rip curl takes you out rapidly into the away from the coast.
Right.
So I'm out in a place where I can't see the land. That guy is on a board somewhere between the waves, so he's all right. And I'm out there, and I'm saying to myself, oh, that's a silly way to die. You know, what a fool. I did say that. So I'm out there. What I remember most was you're between, the waves were very high. We didn't notice them so much when we went out. So I was left now and then between the crest of the wave at the bottom. So my head was sticking up, and you see two long sides of turquoise or greeny blue, like glass, and you're waiting for the wave to crash over. You know, every time it crashes, it knocks your head over, and you're hoping that you can, you know, you survive the next one. And you're trying to breathe, and you're realizing you don't know where you're going, and that you're very likely going to die. And then there's a funny thing that happens. You do hear, and you see this in Kurosawa's film about the mountain climber going up, and he falls in the snow, and then you begin to fall asleep, and then a beautiful woman comes and puts a gown over you, and it's nice to go asleep. This is built into the human in a certain situation, that the body will acquiesce or will yield to the superior force and realize that make a decision. And this is why animals get paralyzed in the headlight. They get unable to act. So one has to be careful. But eventually, to cut a long story short, I got back. I'm a good swimmer. It's easy being knowledgeable after the event. When you're brought out long enough, you can come back in apart from the big waves. So I just swam for as much. But the most important thing in those situations is not to panic and not to be any different than you are now. And that's a real important thing. And that discipline of not panicking will save your life in certain contexts. It happened to me in another context where I won't tell you the whole, it's an interesting story, but anyway, when I was working in a bar and these guys came in to do damage to me, basically, in separate groups. This was in the East End of London. I could tell you all the details of it, but in the circumstances, the best option that I had was to be relaxed and to treat the individuals without any show of emotion. If I had showed emotion, the thing was gone. For too long to tell all the details. So it's a bit more difficult to relax if you think that you're going to be seriously assaulted or that people can do damage to you. So the reason why it's very, very important to learn these techniques is because they're very important for survival, not only for spiritual things. And they're very important if you want to be able to control pain or to limit pain in some way. They're very important to deal with traumatic situations in one's life. But they're not meant to respond to evil. They're not meant to, except if you read about the exorcisms, for example, it's very important, say that a priest is doing it in the Catholic tradition, that they are not goaded by this possessing spirit. They cannot respond to the provocations of the demonic figure. So it's very, very important that everyone learns how to relax and how to control their body for whatever they're doing in life. That's a fundamental requirement. It's a fundamental thing in spiritual tradition. And it's the same thing with prayer or meditation or whatever. They're fundamental needs of the body to bring the body back into a state, to bring the heart back into a normal state. And when you do that, you have a power over your environment and your world and how you respond to that. You give yourself the best option. In some situations, there's no hope for people or whatever, but even in hopeless situations, you still have capacity. So, but there is a lot of spiritual traditions now, and you'll see them on the mainstream channels. The ones that are on the big stations in the propaganda model only get there because they are effectively furthering the agenda, or they are useful idiots, as Lenin or as one would have described. They are training people to be acquiescent in the face of a real danger. Now, in some dangers, an emergency situation, another side of that, and I've seen it happen a few times, in some emergency situations, what you have to do is react. In the context, for me, in the swimming context, is I had to get in a position where I could start swimming actively against the thing after I'd overcome the initial high waves and all that. And so that's where the action comes in and the persistence. In a lot of situations, people freeze and they don't do anything. So action is important. If you're in an emergency situation where the circumstances around are creating, well, action is important. Now, not premature action, not action that does damage. There was a terrible case in Switzerland that was reported in the media there about a family who committed suicide because the father was being arrested for homeschooling the child. So they're trying to, this is what's happening. A lot of people in Switzerland, France, they took their children out of school because they didn't want them wearing masks. And so then the state begins to pay particular attention to them. So, and then that's recorded as, or kind of reported, or insinuations about these non-scientific people that were over fearful of the state. God loved them, God rest them. So, it does apply. People shouldn't overreact to situations they encounter with authorities and in that sense. So, I urge non-violence. I urge pacifism. And coming from an Irish situation, in the end, there's an Irish singer in the Dubliners. He was a communist, actually, but he was of an old school type where they believed in workers' rights and things like that.
Right.
And I don't support communism, but they were a different type. And in Ireland, there was kind of socialists who were Catholics as well. You know, it was slightly a bit more complicated. But he wrote a recitation. His name is Luke Kelly. He's a great singer with the Dubliners, red hair. You'll see he's one of the greatest voices that I've heard. And I knew some of the Dubliners. I didn't meet him, but his family came from the same area as me. But he has a recitation about changing in Ireland. This was years ago, and he said, he was referring to Roisin. Roisin was a name for Ireland, if you like. It means a little rose. And he said, for what died the sons of Roisin? For what did they shed their blood? And he was asking about, why did all these people fight for freedom? Was it for this? You know, was it for, and he goes on, to whom do we owe our allegiance today? And he was beginning to understand that the allegiance of the state that they fought for was owed to bankers, was owed to money. And he was wondering about what that sacrifice was about. So the point I would argue is that, one, there's a moral issue about use of violence, and that's the primary one. One has to be imaginative, and one has to, so I would point to Gandhi, and Gandhi was influenced by the Irish constitutionalist Daniel O'Connell, who's buried not far from where I was brought up in Dublin. He was a barrister as well. He fought for repeal of the laws which restricted Catholics, Presbyterians, Jews. He was the one that Frederick Douglass came to Ireland to see, and he brought around. He was heavily influenced. So that he urged non-violence. That's very, very important. And Gandhi, etc. not talking about context of legitimate self-defense and all that. And there's legal authority for that. But it's very, very important that one understands the dynamics of interaction, as you learn from martial arts, that you deal with a force. And often in martial arts, it's about understanding that force and neutralizing it. So if someone throws a punch at you in an unprovoked attack, you can teach them a lesson by deflecting it and by disarming them, if you like. And there's lessons you can learn from everything. So when someone throws a punch, and as you know, there's a movement in karate, for example, where you pull the arm, you move the person on the momentum that they're going, or the trajectory they're going, and you can stop them doing damage to you. And the person may learn a lesson from that interaction in a non-empty hand context. So a lot of the passivity things, passivity people, oh, let's calm down and all that, is certainly a mechanism to deal with anxiety. And a lot of people are anxious, but you will always have that anxiety if you don't find your higher force. You will always be anxious. So you'll always be dealing with that anxiety. People think when I talk about these issues, oh, you must be very anxious. And they begin to patronize me sometimes as if I'm afraid of things. I'm not afraid of any of those things. I don't have that fear about this. Certainly one is concerned about one's family and what happens and all that, and we can be irritated with a lot of things. But I'm not spiritually afraid of those things. I'm certainly not afraid of death or any of those things. And in the Irish context, I talk to people, and I've met people that did use violence, and they were in prison, and my relations were in prison, and all this kind of stuff. My argument is that our capacity will always be limited, because we're dealing with an apparatus, a military apparatus that has resources that can really, we might be able to stop them, but in stopping them, we may lose our soul, and at the end of it, lose their energy, and they come back and take the rest. Right. So Ireland got independence, but in one generation, it was declared a republic in 1948. You can trace independence in 1921. The Constitution came in 1937. It was declared a republic in 1948. And then in the 1970s, they joined the European Community, which actually gave away sovereignty. So it's only one generation, in a way, that it was really sovereign. And I question the extent, actually, even though my family were involved in constitutional politics by then, to which we were really independent. Because what happens is the imperial power just changes into a different form. It changes state into finance and that. So there's an illusory power to certain political freedoms. The obedience point that you mentioned, obedience is a dangerous tool. The Jesuits are the classic organization that developed the idea of obedience. So if Malachi Martin was a Jesuit, so that means you come in and I say, okay, I'm in charge of you. I say, Evan, I think I want you to study, as happened to him, ancient languages of the Middle East. You go off and do 3 PhDs and then come back and we'll see. And that's the way it works. So it have utter obedience. And the system is so effective that Himmler studied the Jesuits in order to develop his higher SS things. So these mechanisms, obedience, your obedience is meant to be to the highest force. You have to have you have to obey certain principles, obey the law, whatever. But your true obedience is to the highest consciousness. That's what the Quakers realized. You can't, that's why they didn't go to war, because their obedience was to God and towards higher principles. That's why they became, whatever, at certain times vegetarians, against war, against vivisection, because their conscience, which they believed was directly connected to the highest divine force, said, no, you can't put that principle below this. So the idea that obedience is necessarily good is wrong in many senses. It's overrated. It's overrated in the religious traditions, and it has led to a lot of problems. And obey, as we know in the film, They Live, obey. Obey. Oh, it's great. Be obedient. They've trained people to be very obedient. The last point, I was doing a talk week or two ago, and I was putting this point, and these are a lot of people involved in science and things like that. And I think one of the chaps found me a bit, maybe, I don't know what maybe aggressive or assertive in the point. And this is a point. If I come and speak very, very slowly and very quietly like a machine, and I'm not threatening, that's okay. But if I have any passion that is not like a machine and is not very, 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 very threatening, well, that's okay. So if I came along and said that you don't have to worry.
There we go. Hey, sorry. Yeah, I think my internet cut out for just a second, or you were.
I was a bit worried because you froze on my screen. I said, I can't have killed him, can I? With that
I was going to say, if anything, sometimes when we get too deep into the truth, I think Zoom and the powers that be start interfering.
It's the first time that someone I've talked to, rigor mortis, has said.
Yeah, right. It's like it shocked me to my core. It died during Zoom. That would be very unfortunate. I'm a little too young to be passing on like that. But
well, probably make it go viral, eh?
I was gonna say, well, the thing is, somebody would have to upload it, and this is on my computer. So I mean, somebody would have to come to my computer and upload it.
You're okay. They're watching you, Evan.
I know. Yeah, they got all eyes, big brothers all over. Yeah. But yeah, I didn't get to hear the end of your point. You started talking, and it almost sounded like a very wise monk in the Himalayas when you're speaking with that very low tone and the notes off the motion.
Oh yeah, I think I'm thinking of putting on a bit of makeup and make a bit of money that way. Accept that, you know. Oh yeah, everything is going to be fine, and yeah,
right.
But, don't you worry. Don't you worry about this. This will disappear. It's all an illusion. Don't mind that. They're trying to make you afraid. Everything will be great. But actually, there are certain guys that are doing that message. There's loads of guys appeared on the internet and saying, "Oh yeah, it's really bad, but everything's going to be okay." Now, magically and mysteriously, that the 1% of how it's going to be okay is not
right. Right. They don't give the details. It's like it's all going to work out. There's that. Again, that's almost like a blind trust, if you will, blind faith to the just trust the process, if you will.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a lot of the the QAnon and like some of the movements that are like, we see the truth, but we're just going to trust the process. There are people working for us, almost sort of looking for that external savior, if you will, right? And it's very interesting because to draw back on a lot of what you're saying within your points, it makes me think of the Bhagavad Gita, the very first chapter. It talks about there's more cowardice in laying down your sword if a battle is just, right? If a battle is meant to be fought and it's for, a higher calling, serving true spirit, true consciousness in its nature. If you're laying down your sword, there's a level of cowardice within that. If you know what you need to do is correct. But then at the same time, you almost need to find that balance, because if anything, it feels like what we're dealing with, and I don't know if you're familiar with Paul Levy's work, but he talks about Wetiko, dispelling Wetiko, and this feels like this is all an extension of that sort of collective mind virus in a lot of ways, right? It isn't necessarily, the root of it is not a physical entity. So really, I mean, there are certain physical actions we could take, but something like going up against a military or some sort of, that sort of traditional war mindset, I don't know if it's necessarily, that's not necessarily the correct solution per se, because I don't know if it addresses the pure, the Wetiko virus, the mindset of true materialism and defining ourselves by that sort of type of consciousness, right? I mean, those are all manifestations of consciousness. This transhumanism is a manifestation of our material consciousness. But when we respond from a very materialist place ourselves, if anything, we sort of perpetuate the same cycles, and we sort of create. We don't create the change that is actually coming from a space of higher consciousness. So I think we need to be very mindful and very
conscious, but at the same time, be willing to take action. It's almost sort of like being the wise fool. Bring it back into tarot perspective. We are a fool in the sense that we don't we're on the forever path of learning. Like, we don't necessarily have all of the answers per se, but we're committed to taking action. We go into that next archetype. What's the answer? It's action, action, action. It's not the willingness to, or the acquiescence to lay down our swords. We pick them up and we find the courage within ourselves and connecting to that higher consciousness. But also in the sense that there's more to learn and there's more to understand, and just committing to that path of action. So it's a very complex situation that we find ourselves in, because I think a lot of the solutions that we're going to need they're going to have to come from outside the box. And that takes a combination of going inward and finding solutions within ourselves, but then taking action in the external world based on sort of that internal call, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
So
that's right. There's a few things just to finish off. I remember talking to my father's uncle, who was imprisoned, and his brother was, my other father's other uncle was imprisoned, and in a lot of prisons in England, and that going back to the time of the Irish War of Independence. But this man was a very relaxed, happy, jolly man. You wouldn't think he'd say boo to a goose, and he was very happy with life and very positive. And but they were in situations where there was, direct military conflict that was directly affecting what was going on in them. So the scenarios are different, but it goes back to, I advocate non-violence, and the associate with that is an extrapolation to begin to struggle on a higher plane, and people don't really understand. If you have no idea that there is a different mystical level or different levels of reality, well, it doesn't mean anything as well. So the idea, like in the biblical context about Ephesians, we wrestle not with flesh and blood. I mean, that reflects a lot of spiritual ideas, that this is a kind of cosmic battle. A lot of people don't understand that. I often think that Star Wars, he was referring to a deeper phenomenon associated with when he's talking about the Force. He did study mysticism, and he is talking about an actual force. He's talking about the Empire. It was an accurate premonition of what he saw was happening, and that duality continues. It's mythic. It's mythic because it's true in a number of senses. So we have to begin to think in certain senses. If you look at Steiner, and you look at who is opposing the forces, who is opposing the Luciferian, Ahrimanic, satanic force. So you have Michael, the archangel, who's relevant in the monotheistic religions, all of them, and to non-believers as well. It's a figure that comes up, and it's a very potent figure, and it's an potent actual figure. Say in the Catholic Church, that was the figure that they used to say a prayer to, that they banned and they begin to be taken over. But they because Michael was the figure that was believed to be able to oppose Luciferian things. Now people think, well, that's a bit ridiculous, and these forces are not real. But if you look at the conjuring and the conjuring of spirits and all that, even people that don't believe utilize the symbology and the figures. But the point I was going to mention is that associated with such figures is the idea of a sword of light, in my view, because they have a sword, but the sword is of a different dimension. It's not a sword applicable in this context, because Michael is not operating on this plane. So the sword of light, it comes up in Celtic mythology as well. So the sword it has mystical properties. It's not, you see it in the Arthur legend, you see it in Excalibur, but it's representative of a higher force. And in many senses, the sword represents the higher aspects of the human being, of discipline, of force, which is marshaled, and discernment, and able to distinguish between different things. So it's referring to the significance with your spiritual elements of the higher aspects, where you can distinguish between what's real and what's not real. And so there are important metaphors to be gained by looking at what these, or how these figures were represented. So there was always the issue in Ireland about, well, how does a few peasants, I'm not saying that in a derogatory sense, people without any power, well, how do they set themselves against an empire? You know, I mean, how do they actually militarily struggle against that? And that was why they sought to develop guerrilla tactics and to develop systems that work in asymmetric context. Now, when you notice in the context of the current conflict going on in Europe, that all the systems are converging. So they utilize finance and all this together because they're converging. It's really one force that comes into the military industrial complex. It's all one force. It's as I call it, it's a security, industrial, military, pharmaceutical complex. It's the same as with the truckers in Canada, that you make a donation and then you're being investigated and knocking on your door. It's an integrated force. So as well as the individual non-violent reaction, spiritual evolution, and the utilization of their opportunities, not channeled, not captured, not deterministic, unpredictable, can't be predicted by the machine. There is the issue of organization of people of goodwill that are trying to unite in an opposing force. And as I've said before, mystic murmuration, and another idea is of graphene. Graphene is one of the substances that is allegedly been used or explored in relation to implants that some people believe has been implanted for that purposes, when they look at patents that have been registered, whereby the digital currency will be based on you. Actually, in future, you are the currency. So you will be the money disappears. It's you that becomes the currency in a slave society, and your body parts and your genetic history and what you can supply. So, but graphene is characterized by a very, very thin construction of one atom that's so thin that it can be very, very powerful, and it can change state. So the connections between these atoms can change into different forms, which is what makes it into different states. So if people begin to link together, people that are on some spiritual paths, they will come and do so from their own position, from what they know about. But there's some assumptions there, some assumptions that they have come somewhere on the journey, that they have that self-esteem, that sense of the dignity of their consciousness, that the dignity of other people's consciousness. They want to reaffirm that against a mechanistic description of them and a reduction of them. And they know that they will have less opportunities to communicate in the future, because it will be taken down. It will be written off. The legislation is happening all around the world in a coordinated way to classify anything that dissent as misinformation, disinformation. So there will be one narrative and no dissent. The only dissent that will be tolerated will be paid for dissent, which is not going to threaten the establishment. So in that sense, the organization as well has to form, and we'll have to look at some models that are different, whereby people operating in their own sphere can begin to communicate and again, in a non-violent way, in relation to imaginative strategies to deal with the things in ways that can't be captured, can't be organized, can't be controlled, can't be predicted. We may have as well a return to what happened to some extent in the Soviet Union, the Samizdat kind of protest, and the analog protests, posters, things, other ways of communication. That will happen as well, because people will return to other mechanisms. But the most important thing they have to do in a social context is maintain social relations. The reason why we were segregated from each other, or they tried to do that, was because people are more susceptible to authoritarianism if they're separated from each other. That's one reason. And then they're more dependent. And then we have the Stockholm syndrome setting in, where they begin to love their captor, and then they hate their neighbors, and then there's no opportunity for any dissent to build and or to validate your concerns. And that's a constant process. Now they're concentrating on insulating the houses. That's probably so the next time they can keep you home longer when they tell you that the world is disintegrating, as as Philip K. Dick kind of anticipated in the penultimate truth in his book.
Right. No, and it's interesting because I've been reading Hannah Arendt's work on the origins of totalitarianism, right? And this is very much
important, yeah.
Right, and this is very much a technocratic new form of totalitarianism. So it's interesting. It's very much enforced through the idea of terror and fear, right? And it feels as though you talked about sort of coming back and keeping relations with one another. It feels as though, and I've especially noticed this within city environments. It's not necessarily, some part of the reason I've been very called back to smaller towns and like living more rural is city environments. There's almost a natural fear of other people, right? If you're in a small town, everybody's waving at one another. There's a more sense of a community, shared camaraderie, right? And that hasn't necessarily died, but in larger cities, you have everybody is sort of within a rat race, and there's a sense of competition amongst one another. There's a fear of the people who you're walking you don't wave at the person walking down the street. If you do, you're considered crazy. It's like, what's wrong with you? So it feels as though when we're caught in sort of some of this new technological society and outsourcing all of our relations to the metaverse or online, and there's certain gifts to that sort of interconnectivity online. If anything, it feels like a manifestation of our interconnectedness as a species. The fact that I can sit across the world essentially and talk to you on Zoom, like that's like great. There's a recognition of our global interconnectivity in that. But at the same time, when we outsource it, we kind of grow into a paranoia, into a self-enforcing terror that makes this sort of new form of totalitarianism possible. So I feel like it's going to come back, sort of it's almost going to lead to we need to lead to ourselves to a creation of a parallel type of society that is more based in community, that is based in camaraderie, and get almost more of a gift economy type of model, instead of becoming so dependent on this technological this new technological way. And certainly these principles are going to come to, like, they are leaking their way into small towns of course. I mean, you still have all of the large EMF towers and the bringing out the 5G and things of that nature, and people have social media. A lot of the relations are still online, but there's a deeper connection still in those towns. There's still there's a connection to the land more. There's a connection to one another more. Everybody knows each other. So there's a deeper sense of community that still lives within that I feel is the heart of how we can come together against a force of this nature. Even if people within that community are still caught in sort of some of the material ways of life, and there's still a greater sense of purpose, I feel, within those types of structures, as opposed to living so separated, not just from others, but from yourself, when you're really in almost, I'm at a point I call cities human zoos, because you have the comforts, you have the pleasures, you have basic survival needs that are met within a city environment, but it's very difficult to find that sort of intrinsically wild nature. It's a very much an artificial simulation of a natural environment, like a tiger in a cage at a zoo, right? It has everything it theoretically needs to survive, but when we look at it, we see a sense of sorrow. We feel a sense of, we know it's missing something, and that's something that is missing is nature. And it's the same thing with humans in a city. And I think it's less so when you start looking at smaller communities and communities that have more autonomy and maybe more control. Like, you can go and get local food, you can find cleaner water. There is a deeper connection to nature, and there's a deeper relationships in there, right? And so I feel like that a switch to that sort of lifestyle can in itself be a radical, like revolutionary type of action that we were speaking about earlier, right? And that's not in the form of violence. It's not in the form of the war against any sort of entity. It's a commitment to a different type of lifestyle than that is being proposed, and that in itself creates an alternative solution.
Yeah. Can I give you the bad news?
Yes, please do. Please do.
No, but this is why it's all important. It's very, very important I mean, if the world had been left to me at a stage before these big entities like the European Union came,
yeah.
I would have preferred that we had international competition. So Ireland says, we're going to be the green, independent, self-sufficient. If you want to come here, you can come. These are the conditions. And New Zealand says, we're going to be this. If you want to come to this country, here's what we have to offer. And the state in the United States says, this is what we do. And then people, if you accept global movement, let people choose. I want a place that respects blah, blah, or uses organic stuff and sell that. But that's never going to happen. See, this is the deadliness of the system that's happening, is that the intent is to have a global, automated, centralized, technocratic, transhumanist, monocultural system.
Right.
There's something about the original machine nature, the obsession with control, with fixity. It's like some of these mental diseases being projected into the world. So they talk, I know that Paul Levy's talking about the mind virus, and I agree with a lot of it. But there's other, if you look at it in a collective term, by analogy, the public have got Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
What happened yet? Oh, well, Russia inquiry. Oh, that's cool. Well, what happened? There was something about COVID, but now, no, it's Ukraine. Okay.
Right.
What was the thing? What did he say? Weapons of mass destruction, move on. So the public have got some kind of Alzheimer's, and the psychopaths running us have some kind of obsessive disorder about control, or as tech autism, as you use Taleb's thing. Not saying anything bad about autistic people, but just about that disposition. So there is some deep obsession, which is so deep. It's not about any pathology like that. It's consistent with the Ahrimanic force that wants to make things material and controlled. And this is what the deeper force is. So it's not stopping. It's not going to leave you alone. So the options are gone. So the options for communities now, I don't think they'll tolerate them. That's what my belief is. So the dragon, if you like, the many-headed hydra had planned that, and that's why Agenda 21, Agenda 30, whatever those ideas effectively mean, as far as I can see, that you won't be able to farm. They're going to make it so bureaucratic, so difficult. The Chinese are buying up land in the United States. The tech giants are grown up. So one strategy that they use is to choke a living thing. So it's like the anaconda. So you have a little community, you say, okay, well then no bank there, no this, that, no. And you can be independent, but they'll force you to participate in the systems. Okay, well, you have to fill your forms in, and we don't have any Wi-Fi. So it will be total. So being totalitarian, they mean so yes, those things are very, very important, and I advocate them, and I know people that are doing it, and I support them. But we have to make sure that they can stay in the water. They can keep their head above the water at this stage. In relation to long-term planning, the dragon is still there that Michael is fighting. That's still coming after us. So, and they're still coming into every community. They're coming into every place. So that thing is going to continue. So in relation to, for example, there's a film called, I don't know if I mentioned this before, there's a film called The Field, which was with John Hurt and Richard Harris. It's not a great film. So although Richard Harris was very good in it, it's not a great film because I think the film director changed the ending for kind of political reasons. The play was interesting, but the film that they used, my grandfather used to be my grandfather used to live there. The actual film that they filmed it in the west of Ireland. So I've seen that transition of the culture and the community and how that goes. But they have a deliberate policy to break that down, to break communities down, because they don't want homogenous groups. Now, in the United States, there's still a bit more, for intrinsic reasons, often going back to the Constitution. It's been more difficult to impose the will, but you can see what's happening in Ireland, for example, smaller countries. They use them as test beds for what they're going to do afterwards. So the implication of this centralization is that agriculture will be mechanized, or they will leave it. And they will leave it in ways, so they say, oh, this place that you're living in, well, there's something that has to be protected there. We need to protect the environment, often for spurious reasons. And they're going to bureaucratize the living thing that's going to be. Now, I'm not putting people off that. I'm just saying that we have to be aware that there is this process which is so deep. And that's another reason that we have to kind of oppose. We have to find principles that defend the individual. Years ago, when I was talking about local heritage and things like this, my strongest argument was in favor of the local community. Even at the time, I saw it in comedy, for example. They often use comedy as a programming thing to denigrate what it is they want to attack. So they attack the local community. They make the people, they're doing it now actually. They're making programs about people that live in rural areas in the United States, and they're trying to paint them as oddballs and weirdos. And you can see that. I've seen that on the internet and things like that. There's a deliberate attempt to alienate people, to make these people look like they're very strange, living in strange communities. Why would they want to live out in those places and be dependent? And one last point, the benefit of growing up in Ireland is that Ireland was so concentrated. You could see everything. You had connections with people involved in these things. For example, I remember coming home from school one day, I think it was in 1974, and getting out of his car there was an old guy, and I recognized him. He was just getting out of his car. I just said hello to me and my friend, and we knew who it was. And the guy, he was going to a funeral. His name is Eamon de Valera. He was sentenced to death in 1916. He was one of the leaders in the 1916 revolution. This shows you how small the country is. His sentence was commuted because he was actually born in New York. His mother had gone over there, and he had been involved in the various struggles and became Irish president. And that. But Ireland was so small that you could see these things. You could see these people. He was getting, his car was a distinctive car, was stopping at the grave where Roger Casement was buried. Now, Roger Casement was executed in 1916 in Pentonville prison in London. He had been knighted for his work in exposing the terrible atrocities in the Congo and bringing world attention to that, and the horrific things that happen in King Leopold's devastation of the Congo and the rubber companies, plantations. He did the same thing in the Amazon. So he was from Dublin. He was a famous human rights activist, but he smuggled weapons to Ireland in a submarine in 1916 and was caught and was tried with treason, although he was an Irish man, and they hung him in London. So the remains of his body was brought back. So his grave was right beside where this guy was getting out, and a few yards away was the grave of Michael Collins, his great opponent in the thing. So Ireland is a very, very small place. But the point about De Valera that I was going to mention is that he's been lampooned for the last decades because they didn't like someone that promoted Catholicism or spiritual tradition or believed that Ireland should be self-sufficient. It wasn't consistent with the agenda, so they magnified and ridiculed and blamed them for everything. But he was arguing that we should have his ethos was that Ireland should be a spiritual country and live frugally and be self-sufficient. So the irony is they've taken away the spirituality now, and they're saying they're going to live frugally, enforced frugally, with no spirituality. So I mean, there's a great irony, but it also shows that history is close, history is malleable. We have to be aware. My argument in all this is, again, it's not to depress people. It's to say, be aware of the totality of what's going on so that you can understand it and react to it. And certainly it's going to be in community. That's what they don't like, because community is healthy, it's normal. We're used to living in community. We're social beings. We get power from community. Yes, it's a reason why people should do it, but they have to do it now in a way, being aware and linking up with other communities to a network idea as well, to begin to have some power, have some say, have some input, have some interference in a positive and non-violent way in the mechanisms that are imprisoning them. So again, not as a counsel of despair, but as awareness to be, these things are relevant. These things will affect directly how we live our life.
Right, absolutely. There is no running or escaping and burying our heads in the sand. Regardless, really, of where we are, because it is a global movement, and we're already under the rule, whether covertly of the New World Order itself, right? I mean, all of the politicians. All you have to do is look up Joe Biden or Boris Johnson or Emmanuel Macron. All of these people, they are agenda contributors of the World Economic Forum, and it's like, who do they work for? And you look at sort of people like the Pope or even the Dalai Lama or other sort of religious leaders. They come back to sort of promoting the particular agenda. I mean, Sadhguru, for example, of direct agenda contributor, World Economic Forum. Dalai Lama promoted the vaccines, for example, when they came out. So a lot of traditions, a lot of what we think is independent it's all interconnected into this global movement. I mean, you mentioned agriculture. Bill Gates is the largest farmland owner in the United States. I mean, he's going to control the food supply within this country, and it's going to make, the small farms and the farmers markets, those things over time non-existent, because you're right, there's going to be this, they continue to make it more and more difficult to have organic produce or organic meats and things of that nature. I mean, South Dakota, where I am, there is it's very rural. You can get access to local meat, you can get access to local vegetables, all of those things, but the prices are going up, the farmers are having more difficulty, and over time that's going to lead to almost an acquiescence to that sort of centralized food system, right, from those local farmers, because that's what they're going to have to do just to survive. So there is no burying the heads in the sand. And a lot of people, when it comes down to it at the end of the day, there's a lot of people who live simply to survive. And when that survival, and maybe they live in a way that is very much in alignment with nature now in a smaller community, or more off the grid, quote unquote off the grid. That's interesting, because a lot of solar people who have solar are still connected to the government state power grid, which is a whole other rabbit hole, I suppose, in itself. But it goes to show you, once that way of life is threatened, they're still going to acquiesce simply to survive, to be able to feed their family, to be able to keep a roof over their head, right? And even if they're in a smaller community, that doesn't mean that they're not going to participate in this sort of centralized means of production, if you will. And that centralized control, it's the dragon itself. It's the thing that's going to continue to really clamp down on our necks. And it's interesting, because I try and equate this almost to each individual being on their own hero's journey, if you will, right? And at the end, you do have to fight the dragon. There is no running from the dragon if you want to actually complete the journey and really gain the wisdom from it and attain the knowledge and bring it back and share the fruits of your labor. Like, you have to go head on with the dragon itself. And there's all sorts of trials and tribulations along the way. But a big part of it is finding community who can help you in this journey and help you in this sort of quest. So I think a lot of us are on the hero's journey. We're very much past the initiation stage, and we're moving much closer to that sort of final showdown, to that direct head-on conflict, if you will. We're well past the initiation. We've faced many trials and tribulations. We're gaining the knowledge. We're coming in contact with people who also see what's going on, and we're starting to really have a greater understanding. And I think we're moving very close to that final, I suppose, showdown or battle or whatever you want to use to face that sort of dragon, which is that sort of centralized system. And I don't know what that necessarily is going to look like in each individual's own life per se, but it means sitting up straight, putting the shoulders back, and having the courage to tackle what's going on head on. And I suppose that's going to look different for everybody, but we sort of are in the precipice of this movement that the centralized power is bringing into our lives, whether we want it to be there or not.
There's one of the benefits of engaging in martial arts or grappling or Brazilian jiu-jitsu in particular, or judo, is that when people are starting off, it's very oppressive when someone is using all their weight and they're sitting on top of it, as has happened to me plenty of times, where some guy is actually sitting on your head, all the way, and trying to choke you and do damage to you, or just inflicting what is a representative of a physical death, where you're overpowered by skill, whatever. But what you learn very quickly, again, is the same thing, is to relax. And it's when you become relaxed, then you can deal with it and you can react to the situation, because you know what's going to happen. You know the pattern, and you can utilize technique to overcome those things. So that adrenaline rush scenario, and the sense of claustrophobia that people have early on, or in judo when people are throwing you and you're up in the air and the ground might seem far away, you begin to find ways to reduce, to make that normal, and to adapt to the situation, and to make an easy situation, a comfortable situation. So again, strangely, the relaxation issue is important, an issue of being placid and accepting certain. So that type of acceptance doesn't mean you're accepting the whole phenomenon. Is you're accepting it in order to deal with it. That's what the thing is. So that's a slightly different point. It is interesting. I think it was the head of BlackRock, and as you know, that BlackRock is the big company that controls a lot of the things. So a lot of people don't understand that really communism and capitalism are the same things. That if you look at the good thinkers, they understand. And Pope John Paul was actually very good on globalization. He knew what was going on, and it was interesting reading Malachi Martin and the insight about what his ideas were at the time. And I'm not saying I agree with them all, but the analysis was correct. And he saw that capitalism, or raw capitalism, or crony capitalism, I'd call it, and Leninism, or raw Leninism, are the same thing. There's no real difference between them. And this is a problem in the United States, because I know a lot of my friends in the United States, they quote to me a scenario of capitalism and how it works that doesn't actually describe the corporatism and crony capitalism that exists. They describe a thing that they have been educated with at the highest levels, and they never question it, and they start quoting me various theorists. I know the theorists, and they don't necessarily say what they do, and they portray a map of reality that doesn't correspond with the terrain of, it's not a proper economy when you don't have control of major corporations, and you don't apply antitrust to stop big corporations, and you don't allow new entrants, etc. You don't have a healthy competition there. But the new guy or Fink said that globalization was over now because of Russia. They're blaming it on Russia. And this is a point that I've been arguing, that globalization was a tactic. They say, oh, you can travel anywhere, you drink your New Zealand wine, you can do this, world citizens. It was a tactic to take power away from national governments. And now they're coming out and saying, look, globalization is over now. And even some of the main guys, they're being upfront, because it was never about any Adam Smith capitalism. It was about this centralized system. Food is going to be automated. I suspect it will be printed. Some rubbish that they concoct. They'll probably make or seek to make us with, as rationing is going to come in some shape or form, probably. Ratio is in that word. It was a Ratio Club, was a famous cybernetics club in the United Kingdom that investigated how to control the human behavior. But rational, they love all these things. They love rationing as well. So it may be that we get rationed, but the centralization will begin to focus now and say, oh, look, you've no food. That's why we need these automatic systems. And here's this superfood that we can produce. Maybe the insect burgers was a bit of to lead you one way and say, oh, well, at least it's not insect burgers. We'll eat this genetically modified food, etc. So that will be where the agriculture is going. They may even, the human body has changed radically, and it's changing radically in a number of ways. In my lifetime, you can see what's happening to people. It may be that they make us unable in a couple of generations to consume food in the way that we did, to make us intolerant or make us dependent. Now, remember, the Irish famine, for example, happened because people were made dependent on the potato. The potato is not indigenous to Ireland. The potato came from South America, as the disease did. Right. And I'm not going to put any conspiracy theories about that, because there's an interesting one that one could if one was creatively looking at. But Ireland, the poor people were made dependent on the potato. They weren't allowed, they didn't have arable land to do. So when a disease comes and that your livelihood is, it's dangerous. All these dependency scenarios create opportunity for doing bad things to people, and makes us less resilient. If you go back, I have plenty of books about globalization because I worked in that area and wrote about it. All the guys, go back, all the world leaders, World Economic Forum, Council of Foreign Security and Relations, all those, Trilateral Commission, all about the benefits of globalization, World Trade Organization, World Economic Forum, IMF, globalization, great, fantastic, citizens' benefits, for your benefit. Now it's coming to an end. I say, well, hold on a second. Well, what was that about? As I said, it was a tactic. It was a tactic to take power away from national governments, so it'll be centralized. And now they say, sorry, listen to me. We actually want you to stay at home. We don't want you traveling. You don't need to, because the robots will be delivering things to your door. The drones will be coming. And we don't want you going out. And if you do, you have all these wonderful Boston robotic things that will chase you down the road. And
right.
They will be your policemen. Yeah, they want to they want to defund the police, all right, but they won't be. What will be coming in instead? Your choice is the cartels coming up from Mexico or the robots. Which do you want?
They'll take the cartels. They'll deal with the humans.
Be careful what you wish for.
Well, I mean, yeah, I suppose that's true. But it's interesting because it plays into the idea, again, something Hannah Arendt talked about in totalitarianism, is that it's not necessarily even enforced by police, but it's more military-esque, right? And it's more government, state-sponsored terror. So, I mean, this centralization of power and something like a defund the police are very much community, I would say, represented entities, right? I mean, especially if you're looking at smaller towns and things of that nature, it's people who are already immersed within the community. So something like a defund the police movement is going to be really just paving the way for a more state-sponsored, military-enforced idea. And, we see, I mean, there's a lot of talk about like the UN army, right? United Nations, which is the United Nations, again, a front for a global governance, if you will, right? The United Nations all coming to decisions and whatnot together. I mean, that's really, it's a front for a global governance with the illusion that all of these nations are sovereign in their own right, right? I mean, they'll come back home and they'll enforce it upon their own citizens, but it was a larger centralized operation. But again, the UN has its own military force, police presence, right? So you have these larger entities which are slowly but surely creating more space for themselves to put the hammer down in certain aspects of all of our lives, whether that be in the agricultural sense. And Bill Gates recently coming out and saying, oh, we need to, rich Western nations, they need to move into 100% synthetic beef, right? He just said that the other day. Like, rich nations should not be eating beef, real meat. And you know, that's an example of the centralized power trying to come down on the local communities, right? And we see it in the economics and the inflation, all of that. Again, it's the centralized forces making a direct impact on consumers within their own community and making things way more expensive, gas prices, all of these things. It comes back to centralized power. So their sphere of influence is simply continuing to expand, and it really simply feels like an expansion of the imperialist mindset, only coming in the form of economics and coming in the form of different aspects. It's not a necessary direct colonization, if you will, but it's a subvert, like in the sense of coming over and openly taking, like ruling over nations like the United Kingdom over India, or sort of the scrambles for Africa. You know, it's not as open and direct, but you know, when you have these economic forces that wield the true power, you have a colonization that's taking place. You have the extension of imperialism, you know, ruling covertly. You know, they don't need to say, all right, we are a one world government and you all fall under the rule now of our dear Führer Klaus Schwab, right? They don't need to necessarily say that to have his influence be felt. They could still use a lot of our almost traditions of previous national power as a way of ruling over in a much more, I would say, covert operation in this sort of global force. Like, they can say globalism is dying, when in reality, it has only expanded and only will continue to expand as.
Oh yeah, well that's an interesting thing, because I've heard people talking about that, and there's an important point of interpretation. Globalization for you might be finished, but not globalization of governance. Yeah. So globalization referred to the removal of barriers on the flow of goods, people, services. That's what they're saying is finishing, because they're going to determine what's going to flow on that. It's not going to be free will. But so globalization didn't particularly refer to the global government or global governance, and that one world, or the New World Order. Now, the New World Order, as we know, goes back to H.G. Wells. It was reaffirmed by George Bush. It was reaffirmed by Gorbachev, coming from the Soviet Union. It was reaffirmed last week by Biden in his speech. So, and on I think it's Wikipedia to have New World Order conspiracy theory in brackets. I mean, at what point what point? So maybe Biden is a conspiracy theorist. I don't know what they're saying. It's crazy.
Well, it's certainly a conspiracy. I don't know if it's as much of a theory anymore, but
so yeah. And as well as that, it's a bit like, so make no mistake that they will come out, because there is a sneering contempt which is coming true, because they realize that they have the straitjacket fastened. And when Yuval Harari says that COVID was the most significant factor of the 21st century, you can be sure that that was part of the plan in relation to, you know, so and that they have achieved their objective, whatever that is. But again, So in the analogy of possession, there's a certain phase where the demon manifests itself to the exorcist. It's because they hide themselves, but at a certain point they will, and then once that breakthrough point is, they will be open in their thing. So there's a kind of analogy in relation to the governance. So, for example, you say about local police. The local police man or woman knows that they need to maintain good relationships with the local community. If you put in someone from a poor place in another country and you give them a job and you give them a badge and you give them an order instruction to do, they're not going to have any loyalty to the local community. And this is one of the benefits of doing that. Or as happened in Ireland in the 1920s, now they deny this now, but they took people that were back from the war, that are suffering, and they used to say they were from the prisons and all that, and now they're denying that, but and make them auxiliary police force. You know what I mean? There's plenty of people that use a lot of guns that in the United States, and on the wrong side of the law, that could be flipped. There's weird things that could happen. NATO is the big force that is the actual military force of the. And now Ireland is neutral, Sweden and Finland. So now they're putting force on them to not be neutral. So this is part you're drawn into the system. And so, for example, the Irish government promised to take in 200,000 refugees from Ukraine. Now, Ireland is a small country, so they promised to take in 200. That's a lot when they can't house their own people. And then Zelensky was saying that Ireland was almost kind of a good friend or something, in the context, or did well, give them kind of report marks to it, and he said, well, hold on a second, what's a neutral country taking 200,000 or, but it wasn't, because the point being that Ireland should join NATO and Sweden should join NATO. And once they do, you have this total military industrial complex system that it also becomes a police force. So you have the apparatus of an international police force that's very difficult to oppose, because you're dealing with the vast resources of combination, which is important, which is the same thing. And this was the point I didn't mention about the loop that I should have, that and you said about you mentioned about the animals as well. Last point, the Fabians, who are important in this context, they were very in favor of protecting animals, which I am myself, but they weren't so worried about humans. Funny enough, this is a strange inversion in that. And of course, their motto was the wolf in sheep's clothing. That was the symbol of the Fabian society. That Shaw and all the eugenicists came out of Victorian Britain in the imperial context. But I have to make one point about the loop. The loop is important. If you think about it in computer terms, it's kind of a piece of a signal going around and activating certain pathways until it gets what I want. So this is if you look at a lot of rap music, it goes back to, they use the Amen loop, which came from the 60s, from 7-second piece from a song that's repeated again and again and again and again. So as an old man, I say to my daughter, all them songs sound the same, and to some extent they are, because it is a loop. It's a loop that's used again and again as a base, and you add things on it. So this thing is very, very important, this idea of a loop. You create a loop of power. In economic terms, when you have different corporations together, they forego competition for cooperation, and then they can make decisions. So you form a loop of power, and then you form loops below in relation to propaganda, in relation to how you feed information. Look at how your news is formed in a loop. You can switch through all the 160 channels, you hear the same message and the different things in the same way. They create a loop of information that keeps on going. So you can go out, if you don't have a television, you can go out and talk to people on the street, and you say, what's happening? And they can repeat, well, Joe Biden, they repeat the thing. They are part of the loop. So this idea of a loop is very important. So with these networks, you will be brought into the loop, and you'll be assimilated in the loop. If you're outside the loop, you have no control, no things, and you'll be excommunicated, and you effectively won't be able to survive. It's the same in the automatic cars that they'll force people to get. You're outside the loop of control of the thing. You can only interact at a certain point. So the loop is a very important idea about how they operate. It's how they operate in propagandistic terms as well. The same message keeps coming again until you get it. In relation to the bringing you into a system, in relation to how they operate, in relation to how they organize universities. So we have to borrow some of these ideas that are there, that really inform the way their mind works. A repeated signal going around and recurring is an important thing that was prefigured by Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings.
Oh, definitely. And it's interesting because, when you look at sort of what their large scale agenda is, right? And you can see how within that loop that you're mentioning, everything is interconnected to sort of this long-term goal of, coming back to the idea of man merging with machine for the maximum efficiency, for the centralized control power, and using humans as really just really slaves. I mean, to put it bluntly, as for the means of centralized power. And, it's connecting them to the smart grid, putting the nanotechnology into their skin, creating the hackable, really robot humanoid, if you will, controlling human perception, controlling food, stripping of sovereignty, stripping of individual autonomy and the ability to be self-sufficient. And then you have your maximized human to really fulfill the needs and desires of this centralized power. And once they have full control of that centralized power, that's, it's interesting because this seems like a system that is built, and imperialism is like this in its nature, where it's built on continuous expansion. It's built on the continuous need for further power, for further greed. So, even once humans are immersed within this loop, it doesn't seem like to me there is a stopping point in the foreseeable future. We can get to the point where humans are fully lacking in their own autonomous ability to even perceive outside of this system. Maybe they have the nanotechnology in them. They have their perception completely warped into this cycle of information and, centralization of power. But even then, based on the nature of imperialism, the reins, the boot on the neck of people is only going to continue. And to me, it feels like this is very much an extension of eugenics-based practices. So we're going to see really the elimination of humans as we know it, and humanity as we know it. And maybe that means the creation of a society of purely artificial intelligent beings, whatever that looks like, where there isn't any sort of humans aren't reproducing. Like there isn't any sort of actual creative forces within the human being anymore, right? So it's really, it's a eugenics-based imperial, I would say, direction, but I don't see a stopping point for it. And based on the fact that there is no stopping point, I also see it collapsing on itself, because at some point it continually eats its own. It continually eats, its own foot, and eventually it's going to eat itself into oblivion, right? That's sort of what I see as, in the long term at least, of this. I'd be curious your thoughts on that, because I just don't see it. I don't see a stopping point on this.
Yeah, there's a lot in that. What I was thinking about as you were talking about is that, and this goes back to the earlier point, but still relevant in relation to Taoism. And one of the important principles which explains their strategy in globalization is what you want to destroy, you must first allow expand.
Mm.
So some of the things we think are happening are the exact opposite. So it's the same process as when the guy in slow motion is throwing his telegraphed punch towards your face, and you step and let the momentum continue till they lose balance. It's the basis of judo. You're breaking the balance of someone else and working with any momentum they give you. That's how they use it against us. So also in Taoistic terms, it's in a yin phase in many senses. It's spreading out in order to integrate Internet of Things into your head, into my head, colonize your consciousness, integrate it. And then it goes through a yang phase where it's concentrated, where it becomes that loop in some shape or form with a different loop of control. And certainly there is a bit, humans as they will stay in the purest form, the best hope they have is as pets. I'm serious about that. And when you talk about Orwell and the boot on the neck, it's curious, as I've said before, about that sadomasochistic kind of image of it. And by a similar thing, they will want to have some humans, not just for experiments, which they have said for 100 years, that's what they want to do with the humans, is to experiment upon their fellow humans. They're clear about that. Go back to J.D. Bernal. So if you think it's going to be a nice totalitarianism, remember that's what they have said they're going to do. You know, they can have a bit of fun by, now that they have got a platform in your body with mRNA, they can change your DNA. They can mix you. See what happens when you have a different bit, a chicken gene spliced into you. They can have great fun. They've said that curiosity will triumph over humanity. This is the word of scientists themselves. So there will be a concentration. There is certainly always going to be an issue about that, the fighting between themselves in relation to the, it'll be a bit like with the Roman emperors. They'll still, and that kind of as well, that you see it with the Roman emperors when you have Caligula and those various ones, whereby they need kind of stimulation because they have everything. But that's where people come in, and people are the entertainment, you know, the gladiators and that kind of thing. That kind of thing, I think, will come back in perverse types of ways. But that's the only reason why they want those humans. They will want those humans to worship the gods. It won't be any fun for them if they don't have people that realize that they have taken this power, like Prometheus. They've stolen fire from the gods, not given it to the humans, but given it to the humans in their loop. So, but there is a cannibalization process. There's no question about that. I think Russell Brand was talking about that, the export of blood from America, and 2%. You know, it's quite amazing. But this is, the farming is of your data and of your physical composition. Your genes are valuable. We know that. We know that they've used this process to get information about people. So if they want to get particular things, they know where to go and get it from. They know, because that's the farm, the valuable farm in the biotech world, the processes. So there is a cannibalization that goes on. And there is certainly an issue. And that's why, if you look at some of the Michael Aquino and the satanic, the more, I don't know if you want to call them intellectual, but there is those guys out there. And you can see from those type of quarters, some idea, which corresponds, funnily enough, with what some of the Jesuits like Teilhard de Chardin were talking about, the crystallization of context. They're mad into this idea of turning living creatures into crystallized form, because then that's kind of in some way fixed. And so they keep using these images, and Bernal was a crystallographer. They want things to be fixed. They don't like fluid things. So that's a typical left brain issue. Oh, that's moving around, it's messy. Fix it in some way. Make it fixed. Make it robotic. Make it controllable, so I can control all of it. That's also the magician way, the left-hand pathway. It's a Faustian way. It's to exert control. It's not to live with the forces that are out there. It's not to live with the Tao, as C.S. Lewis talked about, that the magician wants to control. And traditionally, in spiritual traditions, you adjust to the forces around you. Now, that's the deeper sense that is legitimate about, reacting to the and relaxing into the forces that is recognized, but it's not to succumb to human force which is exerted over you. But the idea would be that they would be able to. Now, there's a perverse corroboration in their worldview of the idea of an entity which is a human somewhere in there, that many of them would believe that through cryonics, through integration of information with their mind, that there will still be them, still be an I, a self there to do it. They're not all going to want to just feel part of a bigger entity, and there were some that will do that. They want to be joined up with other people in some way, or extract some things. So it's not a question about whether they succeed in that. The question is about what they destroy beforehand. So we're not really interested in whether Stalin is successful in his own terms, or whether Hitler is, or whether Pol Pot is, or whether we're concerned about what damage they do to us. But don't want that. So that could happen, but it's no consolation to us if your mind is trapped in a machine somewhere and you live in a cartoon,
Right. It's that creation of a matrix within a.
The last point is, as well as that, the last point on that is, if they want to create a hell, they could put you in some kind of loop in some form where you have a Groundhog Day idea.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was going to say that's the exact what you just described, putting in the loop. It's creation of a matrix within we really already live within a matrix. So we're almost simulating, unconsciously simulating our own reality now, and trying to outsource it into a technological realm, which it's just fascinating how so much of this agenda, so much of this transhuman movement is based on an illusion of who we think we are. A lot of it, it's based on that fear of death, fear of the unknown, like you mentioned, and the idea that somehow we are not already immortal as human beings, and we're very attached to the finite ego material presentation of this, and because of that, we're willing to really destroy what humanity means for the artificial simulated reality of immortality, and self-sacrifice the human body and really what we know to be as humanity for the potential extension of what we perceive as consciousness, but reality is just ego in its fullest sense, right? I mean, there's a very skewed idea of who we are. And I think, again, like we mentioned throughout this podcast and the last podcast we did, getting to know that spiritual consciousness and uncovering who we are beyond the veils of illusion is really what frees us from looking at this with a sense of, oh, I see why. I would say the attractiveness of this. We recognize the fallacies of it. We recognize how it's built upon a facade. The whole foundation of it is built on an extension of ego, and there is no need to attempt a quest for immortality, because our who we are, spirit. Death is not a finality. It's simply a transformative process. And whatever beliefs we hold about that and what happens next, everybody's going to have their own idea on that, but we can find that truth within ourselves. We don't even need to go into the external world to necessarily find that. We can find that within ourselves with enough self-exploration, if you will. So it's fascinating to see the inversions of of the self.
And the key point for people to remember about themselves in their own life is, it's like I'm not going to talk about quantum physics because everyone does in the talk, but the idea of the significance of comparing it with classical physics, the idea of the necessity of the observer and the significance of the observer reflects in some way the idea in all the traditions that behind all these things is you who is the seer. The seer is behind all things. And this is neglected by the scientists when they talk about, oh, well, we can't perceive the world and we're fooled. And they're talking about our physical construct. Even then, they fail to see that there is a seer behind it, which is witnessing these things. This is our spirit. It can morph or be connected into your state, that some people would see as a guardian angel. The Persian mystics used to see it as the man of light. This is the activated force that we have accessible to us, that we can draw upon. And those things will always be there. It'll be there when you leave your body, as we know from the various experiences, that there is that seer that will still exist and is persistent. And that's what they can't accept. And that's why they have this great fear. They're great. And we should be aware of their weaknesses. Instead of concentrating on their power and concentrating on our vulnerability, we have to begin to look at their Achilles heel and their real weakness of their position. Even in this context, and legitimately, if we're in a David and Goliath situation, and their weakness is in those psychological constructs, and their weakness is in the potential weakness of the bonds between them, where they're out after different things, they've made assumptions that are inconsistent, and we have to begin to point those things out, and we have to also not give them the power. People have sat at home watching. If I went through what happened when in NAFTA or the World Trade Organization, or when they reduced all the tariffs on computer goods so all these companies could grow into big monsters, you can be sure that people would remember what football matches they were watching at the time, or what something else, or what something other inconsequential. We can't cede power to these things. We have to pay attention. We pay a price for our attention and our inattention. So when we pay attention, you have to remember that we will pay for our inattention as well. And so we have to pay attention and not pay for our attention. So attention is important. We have to attend to higher things, and we have to form alliances with people that are different to us, but to have some commitment to spiritual consciousness. And don't let other people divide you on that context. Don't let them tell you who other people are, and don't let them tell you who you are, and don't let them put you into a box, fix you into a compartment, and then set you against other people. So it's very important for younger people to realize that these constructions that they've made are all illusory, and they're all intended to play a game with you, so you will be set against other people. So if we recognize our spiritual identity as the identity of who we are really, that's the highest identity, and everyone has that equally, and everyone has that potential, then those people who have activated, who realize, who accept, will accept other people's spiritual consciousness and find those links which are not capable of division if we build on an expansive way and don't get too dogmatic about our belief systems, apart from some distinction between good and bad, of course.
Right.
But we can find collective power, we can find relationships. And once you do make the journey, once you do begin to say, okay, well, I'm going to come out from the crowd, I'm going to put my head above the parapet, you will be surprised that you will find support from, if you want to call it the universe, from people. You will find synchronicity, you will find doors opening, you will find solutions that you would not be able to do with your left brain, cognitively, piece of paper, working it out. It doesn't work like that. The bigger powers are far more intelligent than our rational brains. The power in us, the healing power, the imaginative power, the power to take information from that's invisible, unknown to us, or to open to revelation. We have those things, so we should activate those things and believe in those things. And then we'll be able to not only see our own lives, but see the weaknesses and the strategies that can non-violently deal with these things, to support each other, to have a narrative that can become more robust so people can see clearer, so that they can unite against it, so they can see when someone is trying to choke them or try to choke their community or country or whatever. So we can relax knowing what's going to happen and the pattern and what the correct response to that should be, and the correct self-defense and the correct solution to overcoming and achieving dominance in the situation. So the boot on the face is only going to happen. Remember as well that about Orwell, that Orwell was fighting as well for, you know, against the Stalinists, but he was fighting for a quite extreme position as well that wasn't necessarily going to lead to freedom. So when he's telling us about the boot on the face, some of his mates might have been putting the boot on the face as well. He wasn't that far off it. So you have to be careful about some of these things. I don't support any of these materialist doctrines that wants to unify power in an elite, in a party, in a centralized position, whether they're multi-millionaires that spout about the free market, or whether they're communists in old Chinese communist Mao Zedong's suits. I don't care if they want to exert power over the world. I'm not in favor of it.
I absolutely agree. And it's interesting because once you start playing into the game of identification with awareness instead of identification with labels, you know, I'm not Evan, you're not James, we are an extension of awareness itself, like far beyond the individual labels and identities, right? And you and I, in theory, could form an alliance on the fact that, oh, we're both from Irish backgrounds and we have these similar like identifications in common. We could unify around that. But in doing so, upon that unification, we inherently separate ourselves from really the whole. And if we identify with simply awareness, we identify with the underlying force of our true nature, the creation itself, then there's no room for separation. There's no room for the division.
Yeah, that's right. And when they're talking about these things about consciousness, I say consciousness refers to the spirit. They can't identify it because they sought to take the spirit out in the 1860s and they've never been able to solve it. So the best accommodation would be spiritual consciousness, that we all have spiritual consciousness, and to take that back into the spiritual domain and to recognize that as the common heritage of humankind, so that even if one comes from an Islamic tradition or a Buddhist tradition, or though they have different descriptions of the same phenomenon, to accept that we unite in our spiritual identities above the particular nomenclature and things in order to defend the spiritual heritage of all mankind, womankind, humankind, against forces which want to take that away, which want to treat us as animals. It's not a time for division. It's not a time to find fault with people. It's to find commonality. And they assumed that in one of the motivations why they want to move a lot of people around, as they have been doing, is they believe that by creating heterogeneity, that it will destroy homogeneity that might react against them. They realize that certain groups, if they have a shared experience, will be able to unite. So they said, okay, well, we'll mix it up. What we have to do is to realize that the world has changed, and is to seek commonality at a higher level, to use that in our favor, to draw on the wisdom of the different traditions, the different ways of life, the different ways of being, the different spiritual traditions, different cultural traditions, and focus on a few key elements in a robust analysis that enables us to establish, again, an alternative, a loop or a sword that will cut that loop, the sword of the notional sword of Michael, for example, that unites. What maybe the function of that is to begin to notionally cut through and to seek points in which to break that notional loops that they are forming, to utilize those symbols, and maybe that's what some of these symbols are about. That it's about a concentration of energy and perception and imagination to understand how we are imprisoned and how we are going to be imprisoned, and to combat in non-violent forms the mechanisms by which those coils of the snake, or the anaconda, is coming around us and smothering us. Yeah, I agree with you. We have to seek that commonality, which we all have anyway, and that's what all the spiritual traditions say, and not be too particular about explaining and the descriptions of the higher forces, because in those areas we get into, people feel hard. It's harder for them to move away from very deep things. So I referred to the divine force as the unbeknownst with a capital U when I was writing in a mystical accord, to refer to that it was a word that came to me in sleep, in a hypnopompic state, that it was clear, the unbeknownst. I thought it was a good idea. Unbe is not being, but it's not being known, but it does exist. It's put some, and that refers to an older idea of apophatic mysticism, where the thing which is the biggest force can't be described as a mystery by definition. It's like in mathematics, there's still something above whatever the final mathematical solution is. It's the higher factor, and in many ways, if you notice the way all these television programs, oh my God, whatever, they're trying to devalue the highest force. People, the atheists, are always talking about God. If they talk more, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, and why is that? It's a deliberate attempt to devalue. It's a deliberate inflationary attempt to do that. So that's why I think I kind of prefer some of the older ideas of the tetragrammaton and the ideas of an unpronounceable name of the highest force. So it can't be devalued by that, but it's still an entire divine consciousness. So it's why I don't speak too much about it, because I think some things are mysterious. Some things are always beyond comprehension. They'll be beyond human comprehension, but they'll exist. Mysterious factors that penetrate into our worlds through revelation in a different form. They're, as Vallée calls them, incommensurable. They're not things that we can necessarily understand. So a lot of these people believe they understand it when they don't understand it, and that's an advantage too. It's a secret weapon that we have in our protection, that they don't believe these things, that they can't believe, for example, when certain people can predict what's going to happen or we can see the future. And that can be useful in some stages, and it will be useful in relation to understanding the mistakes they're going to make, because they believe that power is the final solution. But it won't necessarily be if we react properly. Right,
absolutely. And I've been referring to the force lately as the great mystery. So it plays into exactly what you've been saying, because it is such a a lot of words like God or universe or any, you start getting into the different specific traditions, it all has a lot of charge, and people, for example, I've had interesting conversations about the idea of God lately with just various people in various places. Very interesting how it comes up. But the first question I always ask, I say, well, what do you mean by God? Because I want to understand what they're, where they're coming from in that, because everybody's going to have their own loaded definition or an explanation, or it's like, okay, what do we mean? Are we speaking of this greater mystery, this greater force, or are we, so I think losing the charged polarization in sort of our rooted traditions and sort of unifying around that greater mystery is really, like you perfectly explained, what we should be moving into, and that can be our really greatest strength.
It's one of the terms that the native people use in the United States, and I've used similar things myself, and that's right. But it reminds us that it is a mystery, and it also, I think there has been a devaluation, and those kind of mental traps, like do you believe in, I mean, I don't, I tend not to answer those questions, because you have to answer all those questions. And even, do you believe, for most people that believe in those terms, it's not a belief, it's a knowing.
Right.
It's not an issue of, I was talking about Fatima yesterday, and when the miracle of the sun happened to Fatima, a lot of people went down on their knees and said, I believe. And I was thinking, well, you're not really believing if you see something in front of you. You know? It's not quite the same, you know. So there is and also a very important fact about the nature of, if you want to call it belief or faith. And this is a word that seems a kind of nasty word in some sense, but it's a very powerful force. And if I looked at people in Ireland, for example, that believed in, or that do, an aunt in London who's still alive, and she would come from a very rural background, and she would have a very kind of close to the land sense of God everywhere, but she's very Catholic as well, and she can integrate them in a wide sense. But for people like that, their belief is a force. It's simple force. It's not an intellectual issue. It's an actual force that you use, that you're part of, that's comforting, that's powerful, gives you insight, that gives you sustenance. So the tricking into an intellectual domain is an attempt to bring it into the left brain where it doesn't belong. It's not limited to there. It's an attempt to squeeze out the goodness of it and to give you the shell. It can't be what it's supposed to be, because this is what Lucas was talking about in the Force. It's about having the power that's available, the creative force of the universe, and utilizing it. This is what all spiritual, what all good magicians were seeking to do, to recognize forces and to work with them, not for destructive purposes. And so that it's interesting as well, all these apparitions that I've been studying. When you have, say, for example, an apparition in the Marian terms, in the Virgin Mary, it's to shepherdesses, to people, to children, to people that are not educated and people say, well, that must be hypnotism, but it's not. It's about the ability of someone to accept the reality of a force. The more intellectual you become, it becomes difficult. You're going to find alternative. And maybe if you want to use the Wetiko or the satanic force, the demonic forces also can play more with intellectualisms. You have more levers to push on. Say he believes this, well, that's the exact same as the algorithms. You know, it's the exact same mechanism that, according to the exorcists, the demons are, well, they're more intelligent in many senses than the people that possess it, in a dark sense, and they know how to manipulate people the same way as algorithms do to get you to achieve your purpose. So it's the same story again and again, and that, whatever, the faith in the mystery, the faith in the majesty of the mystery is a thing that sustains. It's a real force that people can activate for themselves. A lot of people think it's an intellectual force. It's not. It's about opening yourself up to the grandeur of who you are and what the universe is, and that you're part of that, and to recognize the grandeur of other people. And by doing so, you get a combination, and on a higher scale, you get the positive loops, if you like, the virtuous circles that can combat the alternative power that seeks to have a more desiccated power for itself.
Right, absolutely. And that's a really great point, because in theory, when I look at beliefs about self, I try and recognize that all beliefs are malleable and subject to deeper truth, right? I don't necessarily, if there's a belief in something, it means there's faith in that belief, but that belief can be challenged and changed if given a deeper truth, or, you know, there was a blind spot within that belief. But if you know something, why are you subjecting it to belief when it is part of a much deeper mystery? Like, there's a knowing in the great mystery. So that doesn't need to have a I guess, debate about the great mystery per se, and you can have conversations rooted in a deeper knowing, and then explore different beliefs based off of that knowing. But I think there's a deeper truth that we need to identify with. Identify with the knowing, what you know to be true in that sort of great mystery, that realm. But then in terms of all beliefs that are, subject to debate and interpretation, don't identify with that on the personal scale per se.
Can I give an example? Because it was talking about Fatima. If you look at the girl, she died when she was 10. One of the three children. There was Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta, and she died at the age of 10. So she witnessed the apparitions, and she was Catholic before that. But I mean, this kind of was very significant for her, and those kids were taken away by for a couple of days, and they were put in prison for a couple of nights, and they believed they were going to be boiled in oil. I mean, that was serious if you're at the time 8 years old. If someone's telling you you're going to be boiled in oil, but they never changed their view. And she died 2 years after that. She was taken away for an operation in Lisbon. And I mean, when you read about what they did, what was done to her in the medical, it was the context of the Spanish flu. And she had ribs taken out without anesthetics, for example. I mean, it's kind of, but she never changed her viewpoint, and she never recanted, and she kept to her belief, and she was able, as a 10-year-old kid, to utilize now that's a very particular example, but it's not, in a way, the message of the spiritual traditions, whether it's the Buddhist, I'm talking about protest, the Buddhist who set himself on fire and in the 60s, and not only demonstrating power over his body, but and it's not one that I'd recommend to do, but it's indicating a much deeper truth. It's indicating the power of the spirit over the body, over the mind, over the world, and how effective it can be, and that it's a real force. It's a real force that can conquer any physiological fear, anything about that can happen to the human body. The spirit's still triumphant. It's easy for me to say that, but I think that's what the lesson of history is, and certainly, well, in the bits in my own life, I would reaffirm that, but it's the same for everybody, that they have this power of consciousness, which is very, very forceful for whatever tradition you come from. And we have to be informed of the commonality, the common features of the power of belief, as is even in medical terms, the placebo effect we know about. But we have to begin to use these things and use the powers from Tibetan Buddhism, for example, or the martial arts, to help us evolve to a different level, and to help each other to evolve. So we can learn from everywhere.
Absolutely. No, and I think that's a beautiful point, and a beautiful way to sort of look at where we're going, and sort of have that at the root of who we are, recognize the power of our beliefs, recognize the power that exists when we identify with the infinite, and sort of use that as the force of creation. It comes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of how do we actually counteract sort of this agenda? How do we actually move forward with it? It's through the knowing of who we are, and using that as a force that is really unstoppable, ungovernable in a lot of ways. Like, you can't put legislation that restricts the essence of who you are at the deepest level.
As we know, as the Tao Te Ching says, as you know, that the soft will overcome the hard, the water will overcome the stone, it will wear it away through its ability to move, to be unpredictable, and it will, through coming down to the lowest, achieve its power, and that's what the great force of it is. So, and then to change form. So we have all the analogies, we have all the things, we have that power within us, and we have to. There are some little bits where we have to get better at working with people with different religious, different philosophical basis. We get stuck. We all get stuck on particular things. We come to debates, and I find that myself. I'm looking at ways to improve the way I can talk to people that have a different slant, or that react to elements of what I believe in or think about or use as a tool. And we have to recognize that we have to up our game a bit, and that's a challenge as well, to protect ourselves as well, because there will be more attacks. At a certain stage, they may make it some way antisocial to begin to discuss these things. They will begin to identify. They will build a new anti-spiritual movement and identify anyone involved in spiritual activity as involved in something superstitious and dangerous, and begin to denigrate them. So we have to get aware of that, and be resilient and open and pragmatic and cosmopolitan in our psychological approach and strategies.
Right, absolutely. And we've seen just what you described, sort of the anti-spiritual movements and the very material-based strategies imposed time and time again in history. So it shouldn't come as any surprise that that's the direction this is going to go. So James, we're at almost about 3 hours. I mean, okay. I feel like we could keep going down and down and down the rabbit holes, if you will. But I know it's much later where you are, so I want to be mindful of your time. Is there any I guess anywhere you would want to send the listeners if they want to further interact with your work, what you have coming out in the near future, if you got further projects coming or any sort of thoughts?
I have the website, which is jamestunney.com. There's another chap in California who's not me, but James Tunney, whatever, something like that. Website and artist, and you can have a look at that. But yeah, I'm working on that issue of automaticity, and I'll send you a copy when I get around to finishing it off. It's got a bit bigger because I'm trying to show the interconnections. I did try and present an argument in a kind of a smaller form. This will be a bit bigger because we have to get some shared view of what's happening, of the phenomenon. We haven't done that yet because it's been hidden. So now, if you like, and when it's coming forward, we have to recognize what we're dealing with. We have to, it's even like in the demonic possession thing, you have to begin to find the name of the demon and the things and what it wants and what it's doing. So we're getting to know those things now, and there's the point at which we're going to have to get rid of it in some shape or form, or have a plan to, or an organic network of unrelated people that can't be captured, to have a shared mentality, like a positive virus. The positive virus, the opposite to Wetiko. I think we'll have to, whatever, I don't know what it spells backwards, but to counteract that, we'll have to begin to, again, or the satanic context, or the Michael archetype, or to, which is the one I think that will recur, we'll continue our conversations. I'm sure again, and I'm sure we'll have the pace of events out, making things a bit clearer. There won't be any less clearer. So that's a good thing. At least we'll know what we're dealing with as time goes by. So I want to be very positive. I don't want to end on a negative note. We should be very hopeful, enjoy life, and often when things are under pressure, people then begin to enjoy life because they start to live when they let themselves. And to banish fear, it's a mental construct that they know how to use in us. They know how to activate the primitive parts of our brain, and don't be dragged into automatic actions because you feel pressurized, and have a bit of courage. I'm not talking to you directly, but to listen, have a bit of courage, and to utilize the consciousness that you have, and come out of your hidden, come out and make yourself known, because This is the one shot you have. This is it. As we know, it's no dress rehearsal. This is the real thing, and you're here and now, and you have to live your life, and you have to evolve, and you have to assert your spiritual consciousness. Even if you don't like those words about spirit, you have to assert your own consciousness, and that's what other people need of you, and you will find it a rewarding journey when you do so, and you get that courage to come out of the bottle that they want to force you into. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. And I absolutely agree with you. And I don't know about you, but it seems for me, and I'm sure you could attest to this too, I've never perceived as much beauty, simplistic beauty in life as I have the last 2 years, as these darker forces sort of become more into my awareness, and I recognize what is going on and what the illusions directly are, much more able to recognize what is true and what is beautiful and what makes this life sacred. So, despite all the chaos, there's a lot of beauty we can tap into, and a lot of gratitude we can have. And
and the last on that, to corroborate that, if you begin to look at the world in spiritual terms, it begins to just expand, and there are amazing things, and that's absolutely right. And I usually go up to the wood every day, and it's just incredible. And when your awareness is made raw to the reality around you, you will get inspiration, and you will be able to communicate with the beings around you, or the animals around you, and that's a reality. It's not a made up stuff. We're part of that, and we have to begin to open our own awareness, and it's not even an issue of believing it. Remove your limiting beliefs that have been imposed in your head, that have been programmed by a loop, by the forces you're working with, that program into your left brain certain things that limit your understanding. That's not who you are. It is an exciting time, and get close to nature. You begin to help yourself a lot. Yeah. So thanks very much for the conversation, as always, and I hope I didn't bore you too much.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. This has been wonderful. I was going to say, if anything, we could keep going. I would have no problem continuing to go for another 3 hours. So on top of the three.
I notice sometimes the listeners say, I could certainly go for 3 hours, but I notice sometimes if I do a long one over a certain time, the people begin to complain that they haven't got, or the length of time, and so but there's plenty of other issues that on my mind, and plenty of other issues. We touched on issues about the Catholic Church. With the last point, I'll put in a last point as an afterthought, just to finish off, which is an issue to look out for, is, and I've been studying this quite a bit, the role of religious institutions. That, and a very interesting factor that Malachi Martin emphasized going back for decades, was how the religious groups and institutions had lost their faith in the supernatural. So a lot of the organizations, including at the top of the Catholic Church, have lost their belief in the supernatural because of the dominance of the materialist mentality. As a result, they have switched to liberation theology, which is Marxist and Christian mixed up. So this is coming from the churches at the top level, and that has happened in other things. So one has to have a bit of wisdom when one's coming to the spiritual traditions, to be that it is a state of flux. There's an awful lot of things happening, that there's a lot of things are not what they appear to be. So the last point I would make is that be careful as well on your spiritual journey, that you don't go down a wrong path that was worse than what we did. I emphasize in all cases about being careful about cults, about being careful about not getting dragged into things. The opposite, not to be put off traditional religions because there are bad people in certain things. There are still traditions there that you can draw upon, and that the the fundamental rules are always the same, that you have to protect your spiritual sovereignty, and that you have to begin to exercise discernment in these operations. And remember always that the information that is fed to you when you go through the algorithms, through the media, the mainstream media, is a constant assault on the reality of your spirit. And if you're in a spiritual tradition, they will be assaulting that. So you have to be able to distinguish the wheat from the chaff, but maintain your eyes on that. So the next time we talk, we'll elaborate on some of those institutional things, perhaps to help people navigate. But in summary, from what we said, be aware of automizing your life, that force is there. Don't acquiesce in it. Don't encourage it. Don't think it's great when your kids are being dragged into some automatic system to replace a social system. Be aware of those things and exercise your spiritual autonomy and support other people's autonomy, even if they have slightly different expressions than you do. So I think that's we'll finish on that, because Irish people don't stop in the past anyway. Just don't stop talking. So
right, we could, like you said, we could keep on going and going, but I think we
Well,
found the foundation for our next chat. So
okay,
let's definitely plan on making that happen. And
well, look after yourself, and thanks to anyone that listens. Thank you.
Absolutely, you as well, James.